There is a version of Spider-Man's story that everyone knows. The radioactive spider, the costume, the rooftop battles against men in elaborate masks, the headlines in newspapers that could never quite decide whether to celebrate him or condemn him. That version of the story is real, and it matters, and it has been told with love and care by many people over many decades. But there is another version, quieter and less photographed, that lives in the spaces between the famous moments. It is the story of a boy sitting alone in his bedroom, listening to the sounds of the house settle around him, holding a secret so large that it changed the shape of everything he did and said and hoped for. Tonight, we are going to spend some time in that quieter version. We are going to move slowly through the rooms and years of a life lived mostly out of sight, and we are going to look carefully at what we find there. So settle in, let your body grow heavy against whatever supports it, and let the story carry you gently forward. There is a house on Ingram Street in the borough of Queens, New York, that has no particular reason to be remarkable. It sits among other houses of roughly similar dimensions on a block of similar blocks, in a neighbourhood that was built during a period of American history when the idea of modest, comfortable, ordinary life was considered something worth building entire cities around. The street has trees old enough to have grown tall and generous with their shade, and in the spring and summer their branches meet somewhere in the middle of the road and form a kind of natural ceiling over the asphalt below, so that walking beneath them on a warm afternoon feels like passing through a long, slowly turning green room. In autumn the leaves come down in quantities that make the act of raking them both futile and pleasant, the kind of chore that children complain about and adults remember fondly once it is no longer required of them. In winter the street is quieter and the houses pull their light inward, warm rectangles of yellow visible through curtained windows, each one a small world going about its business in the particular way that small worlds do. The house at the address belonging to Benjamin and May Parker is indistinguishable from its neighbours in almost every architectural respect. It has a front porch with 2 chairs that see more use in the warmer months than in the colder ones. It has a garden along the left side that May tends with the kind of patient, unglamorous devotion that produces results not because of any dramatic intervention, but because someone shows up consistently, day after day in all conditions, and does the small necessary things. The front path is swept with some regularity, not obsessively, but enough to suggest that whoever lives here is the kind of person who finds a certain satisfaction in small acts of order. The mailbox leans very slightly to the left in a way that Ben Parker had been meaning to correct for several years, without ever quite getting around to it, though he thought about it sometimes when he came home in the evenings and noticed it again. Inside, the house tells a story in the way that lived-in spaces always do, through accumulation rather than design. There are photographs on the walls and surfaces of nearly every room, arranged with the informality of people who collected them over time rather than decorating with them all at once. Some are black and white, the older ones, showing people who look familiar in the way that relatives across generations always look familiar, carrying in their cheekbones and the set of their eyes the genetic arguments that prove a family's continuity. Others are more recent, in colour, and these tend to cluster around a particular subject, a boy at various stages of growing, caught in moments of ordinary life that were clearly considered worth preserving. Peter at 5, gap-toothed, and wearing an expression of profound concentration over something just outside the frame. Peter at 8, sitting on the porch steps in summer with a book that is slightly too large for him, and a posture that suggests he has been sitting there long enough to have grown entirely comfortable. Peter at 12, standing next to a science fair display with the careful pride of someone who worked very hard and is trying not to appear as though he knows exactly how good the work is. Ben Parker's workshop is in the basement, reached by a narrow stair that creaks in the particular way that basement stairs in houses of a certain age tend to creak, which is to say in a way that sounds alarming to people who are not accustomed to it, and entirely familiar and almost comforting to people who are. The workshop is cluttered in the productive way that distinguishes a place where actual work happens from a place where work is merely stored and considered. There are tools arranged with a logic that is not immediately apparent to an outside observer, but that Ben himself could navigate in complete darkness, which he sometimes had to do when a fuse blew and the lights in that part of the house went out before he had found the torch. There are projects in various stages of completion lining the walls and covering the workbench. Many of them repairs undertaken for neighbours who could not afford professional help or could not bear to throw away something that still had some use left in it. Ben had a philosophy about fixing things that extended well beyond the practical, rooted in his belief that the impulse to repair was fundamentally a moral one, an expression of the conviction that things and people were worth the effort of restoration. Upstairs, May Parker's kitchen is the true centre of the house, the room that produces the sounds and smells around which the other rooms orient themselves. The kitchen smells of things that have been cooked over many years in the same space, a palimpsest of meals that has seeped into the walls and the woodwork and the curtains in a way that no amount of cleaning entirely removes, which is not a problem because it is a good smell, the smell of effort and care applied repeatedly to the project of feeding people well. The kitchen table seats 4, though only 3 of those seats are regularly occupied, and the 4th chair is the one nearest the window, which is where guests sit when guests come, and which Peter sometimes sits in when he wants to feel the quality of the light that comes through the glass in the late afternoon, though he would not have been able to explain this preference if asked. Peter Benjamin Parker came to live on Ingram Street when he was very young enough that the house was the first real home his memory ever assembled, which meant that everything about it accumulated the particular emotional weight of origin. He did not remember his parents in any concrete way, though photographs of them existed in the albums that May kept in the low shelf of the living room bookcase. Richard Parker was handsome in the manner of men photographed in a certain decade, with the kind of face that suggests intelligence and a slight reluctance to be looked at directly. Mary Parker's photographs showed a woman who appeared to be the source of something specific in Peter's face, a quality around the eyes, an expression of earnest attention that gave the impression of someone genuinely interested in whatever they happened to be looking at. Peter had examined these photographs many times over the years, not in grief exactly, which requires the presence of a felt absence, but in the gentle curiosity of someone trying to understand where he came from. He missed, in some theoretical way, people he had never had the chance to know. What he did not lack could not be said to lack was love. Ben and May Parker had approached the raising of their brother's child not as a burden assumed under difficult circumstances, but as a gift accepted with both hands, which is the only real way to receive a gift of that magnitude. They had not pretended to be his parents exactly, and they had not pretended that the loss of Richard and Mary was an ordinary thing, but they had created around Peter an atmosphere of such steady, uncomplicated devotion that the theoretical absence of his parents existed alongside a very present and concrete abundance of everything that parents are supposed to provide. Ben brought a certain kind of wisdom that expressed itself primarily through example and through the occasional carefully chosen remark, offered at moments when Peter could receive it, never in the form of lectures or moralizing. Always in the quiet tone of someone sharing something they had genuinely come to know through experience. May brought warmth so consistent and unperformative that it functioned less like an emotional display and more like a weather system, something that simply surrounded you whether you thought about it or not. What this childhood produced in Peter, aside from a boy who was exceptionally well loved, was a particular inner architecture that would prove, in the years ahead, to be both the source of his greatest strength and the container of his greatest loneliness. He was a child who had learned to hold things carefully on the inside, not from any trauma or emotional suppression, but simply because he was a particular kind of person who processed the world primarily through the interior rather than the exterior. He thought more than he spoke, observed more than he performed, and carried a running interior commentary on the life around him that was several degrees richer and more complex than anything he tended to share aloud. He was not secretive as a child, not exactly, but he was already accustomed to being the keeper of his own inner world, already comfortable with the idea that the most vivid and interesting things happening to him were happening somewhere that others could not directly access. At school, which was the other primary landscape of his childhood, Peter occupied the position that intelligent, physically unimposing, emotionally earnest children tend to occupy in the social hierarchies of American public education, which is to say, he was regarded with a complicated mixture of usefulness and condescension by students who needed his help with homework, mild disdain by students who found his enthusiasm for learning somewhat embarrassing, and occasional genuine cruelty by students who had identified him as someone who would not fight back. He was not entirely without friends, but his friendships tended to be with other students on the margins of the social landscape, quiet alliances of mutual recognition rather than the loud performed affiliations that constituted the social currency of the popular crowd. He accepted this state of affairs with a philosophical equanimity that was partly genuine and partly a very good performance of itself, because he had learned early that the interior life was a resource that social difficulty could not touch, and the books and experiments and ideas that populated his mind were company of a kind that no amount of cafeteria exclusion could eliminate. What Peter carried inside him, beneath the equanimity and the scientific curiosity and the deep private contentment of someone who genuinely loved learning, was a loneliness that he could not have named with any precision, because it was so thoroughly the water he swam in that he had no contrast by which to identify it. He did not feel lonely in the acute, painful way of someone who has lost companionship they once had. He felt lonely in the diffuse, ambient way of someone who has never quite been fully known by another person outside the walls of their own home, who moves through the social world translating themselves constantly into something more legible and less interesting than they actually are. The version of Peter Parker that his classmates knew was accurate as far as it went, but was considerably less than the whole of him, and he had grown so accustomed to this arrangement that he barely noticed it. The way you stop noticing the sound of a clock in a room you spend a great deal of time in. The evenings on Ingram Street, in the years before everything changed, had a quality that Peter would return to in memory many times across the decades that followed, not always consciously, not always with full recognition of what he was reaching for, but with the particular pull that formative happiness exercises on the imagination long after the circumstances that produced it have passed. Dinner at the kitchen table, the three of them. The window, dark by the time they sat down in autumn and winter. The conversation moving through the small events of 3 separate days, and finding in that movement a pleasure that had nothing to do with the significance of any individual item. Ben's jokes, which were reliably not quite funny enough to deserve the laughter they received, but which received it anyway because the act of laughing together was the point rather than the quality of the material. May's attention to the small details of what everyone needed, the glass refilled before it was empty, the extra serving appearing at the elbow of the person who had not quite admitted to himself that he wanted it. Peter's homework spread on the cleared table afterward while Ben read the paper, and May knitted or mended something, and the kitchen held all 3 of them in the particular amber of ordinary evening light. This was the life that existed before the spider bite. This was the foundation. And it is important to understand it fully, to feel its texture and its warmth, before moving into the story of what came after, because everything that Peter Parker became, every choice he made in the years of difficulty and loss and longing that lay ahead, can be traced back to these evenings on Ingram Street, to a kitchen that smelled of things cooked with care, to a man who believed in fixing what was broken, to a woman whose love was as consistent and unglamorous and necessary as weather, and to a boy who was already learning, without knowing he was learning it, that the most important things in a life happen quietly, in private, in the spaces that nobody thinks to photograph. The field trip to the university research facility was, by every external measure, an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in the life of a 15-year-old boy who had experienced very few remarkable Tuesday afternoons. Peter had packed his notebook the way he always did for these excursions, with a genuine intention to take careful notes rather than the performative intention that motivated most of his classmates, and he had read the preparatory materials that the science teacher distributed the week before with the focused attention of someone who found the subject genuinely interesting rather than merely obligatory. Radioactive research, the peaceful applications of atomic energy, the ways that controlled exposure to radiation could alter living tissue in ways that scientists were only beginning to understand. These were topics that sat comfortably within the constellation of things that Peter Parker found worth thinking about on a Tuesday or any other day of the week. The bus ride from Midtown High to the university took approximately 40 minutes through the particular mid-morning traffic of a city that never entirely emptied itself of vehicles regardless of the hour, and Peter spent most of it looking out the window at the passing streets of Manhattan, with the mild, receptive attention of someone who finds cities interesting as phenomena, all of that human effort layered on top of itself over generations, all of those private lives happening simultaneously behind all of those windows, each one as complete and complex as his own. Flash Thompson spent the bus ride being loudly and performatively entertaining for the students in the seats around him, and the sound of the laughter this produced reached Peter at intervals, not quite painful, not exactly pleasant, simply one of the ambient conditions of his existence that he had learned to register without dwelling on. The lecture hall at the university was the kind of room that communicated serious purpose through its architecture. Tiered rows of seats angling down toward a demonstration area, equipped with the careful, slightly theatrical arrangement of scientific apparatus that researchers assemble when they want to show their work to people who are not themselves researchers. The smell was particular to places where chemistry happens regularly, a faint sharpness beneath the institutional neutrality of the building's general atmosphere, and Peter noticed it the way he noticed things, with pleasure and a small private notation that this was what serious science smelled like, which was to say something more complex and less glamorous than fiction tended to suggest. Dr. Connors was already at the front of the room when the students filed in, a tall man with the kind of thin, precise face that suggested a mind that did not waste much of its energy on matters peripheral to whatever problem currently occupied it. He had arranged his materials with the careful efficiency of someone who had given presentations of this kind many times, and had refined the sequencing through repetition until it moved with the clean logic of something that actually worked. Peter found a seat in the middle of the room, which was his usual preference. Close enough to see the details of whatever was being demonstrated without being in the front row, which tended to attract a certain quality of teacher attention that he found more burdensome than useful. The demonstration began in the orderly way that prepared demonstrations begin, with introductory remarks that established context, moved through the principles being illustrated, and built toward the specific experiments that would make those principles visible to people who learned better through observation than through abstraction. Peter listened with the quality of attention he reserved for things that genuinely interested him, which was different from the surface attentiveness he performed in classes that mattered less to him, quieter and more internal, his pen moving occasionally across his notebook, but his eyes staying mostly on the front of the room. Around him, his classmates occupied their seats, with varying degrees of engagement, some taking notes, some talking quietly to the person beside them, some having already concluded that the afternoon would be better spent looking at the ceiling. The spider was in a glass enclosure on a table to the left of the main demonstration area, small enough that Peter had not noticed it immediately upon entering the room. It was one of several specimens being used to illustrate the effects of controlled radiation on living tissue, and Dr. Connors had mentioned it briefly in the context of explaining how exposure to specific frequencies and intensities of radioactive energy could produce changes at the cellular level that the organism's own biological processes would then attempt to incorporate or correct. The spider itself was unremarkable in appearance, except for the faint luminescence that the radiation had produced in its body, a very slight quality of light that was only visible if you were looking directly at it, and only then if the ambient lighting in the room was not competing too strongly with it. Peter had noticed it at some point during the middle portion of the demonstration, and had looked at it with the mild, appreciative attention he gave to things he found interesting, which included most things that were alive and doing something that biology had not originally designed them to do. What happened next is the kind of thing that resists the language of intention and sequence, because it did not happen through anyone's intention, and its sequence was so brief as to constitute a single event, rather than a series of them. The enclosure had not been secured with the thoroughness that the situation in retrospect demanded. The spider, responding to whatever combination of altered instinct and random movement the radiation had produced in its nervous system, found the gap in the enclosure's edge and descended on a thread so fine as to be invisible in the room's light. It came down through the air above the seated students with the unhurried purposefulness that spiders bring to the business of moving through space, and it landed on the back of Peter Parker's right hand at the moment when his attention had drifted fractionally toward the notebook open in his lap. The pain was immediate and specific in the way that spider bites are specific, a sharp, hot point of sensation that announced itself with a clarity that the body reserves for messages it considers important. Peter looked down and saw the spider, glowing its faint, impossible glow, and he brushed it away with the automatic response of someone who has been startled by something small and sudden, and the spider fell to the floor and lay still, and then was still in the permanent way. The bite on the back of his hand was already reddening, already communicating heat up through the tendons and into the wrist, and Peter looked at it for a moment with the examining attention of someone cataloguing a new piece of information before the dizziness arrived and reorganized his priorities. He did not say anything. This matters, in the context of understanding who Peter Parker was and who he would become, because the instinct not to disrupt, not to draw attention, not to make his difficulty into a public event that required the management of other people, was already so deeply established in him at 15 that it operated below the level of conscious decision. He sat with the gathering heat in his hand and the first slow waves of nausea moving up from his stomach, and he said nothing, turned his face back toward the front of the room and continued to exist quietly in his seat, while the demonstration proceeded around him, and Dr. Connor's voice continued its careful passage through the remaining material. The bus ride home was the longest 40 minutes of Peter Parker's life to that point. The dizziness had deepened by the time the class filed back out of the building and into the afternoon, moving now in slow rolling waves that made the external world seem to slide sideways in a way that required constant small adjustments of his balance and attention. His vision was doing something unusual, not blurring exactly but shifting in its quality, as though the information his eyes were collecting was being processed by a slightly different system than the one that had been processing it that morning, everything a degree sharper and a degree stranger simultaneously. He sat in his seat on the bus and held very still, and breathed with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided that controlled breathing is the primary task currently available to him. Flash Thompson made a remark about Parker looking green, and several people laughed, and Peter registered this at a significant remove, the way you register sounds from another room when you're trying very hard to concentrate on something in the room you're actually in. The remark did not hurt in the way it might have hurt on an ordinary afternoon, because the afternoon had already departed so thoroughly from the ordinary that ordinary social pain had temporarily lost its purchase on him. Aunt May was in the kitchen when he came through the front door, and she took one look at the particular quality of pale that Peter had achieved over the course of the afternoon, and moved into the efficient, warm competence she brought to the business of caring for a sick child with the ease of long practice. She established that he had no fever, which was not entirely accurate, but which the thermometer, perhaps confused by the unusual thermal activity already occurring in his body, failed to confirm, and she helped him upstairs to his room with a hand on his back and the quiet, decisive commentary of someone managing a situation she had managed many times before. She brought aspirin and soup, and the particular quality of attention that involves checking on someone frequently enough to be reassuring without hovering so constantly as to prevent rest. Peter lay in his bed and let her care for him and said very little, which she attributed to the illness, and which was in fact also simply Peter, who had always processed difficulty more comfortably in silence than in speech. Ben came home in the early evening and knocked on the bedroom door and said the things that Ben said in situations of this kind, which were not elaborate or philosophically complex things, but which had the quality of solid, reliable comfort that his presence reliably provided. He sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes in the easy way of a man not made uncomfortable by quiet, and he told Peter that he would feel better soon with the calm confidence of someone who believed this genuinely, rather than saying it, because it was the expected thing to say, and then he went back downstairs and left the room to the early dark and the sounds of the house continuing its evening around the still point of Peter's bed. The night that followed was unlike any night Peter had previously experienced, which is a mild way of saying that it was the most physically extraordinary thing that had ever happened inside a human body in that particular bedroom on Ingram Street in Queens. The transformation, which had been proceeding at the cellular level since the moment of the bite, accelerated as the hours passed and the house went quiet and the street outside settled into its nighttime character. Peter's temperature moved through a range that would have alarmed any physician observing it from outside, cycling between a chill that pressed him deep into the mattress and a heat that made the sheets feel like a close, damp enclosure he could not escape. He slept in intervals that were less like sleep and more like brief absences from consciousness, dropping into them without warning and surfacing again with the vague shock of someone who did not know they had left. The dreams, in the intervals of something approaching sleep, were not frightening exactly, though they were entirely unlike ordinary dreams in their physical specificity. He dreamed of surfaces, the specific sensation of pressing his palm flat against a wall and feeling the wall press back, not with resistance, but with a kind of adhesion, a gentle insistence that the contact continue. He dreamed of heights without the fear that heights ordinarily produced, looking down from the upper stories of buildings with a calm appreciation of the geometry below, rather than the clutch of vertigo. He dreamed of moving through the city at a speed and with a freedom that the city had never previously offered him, the streets and their obstacles reorganizing themselves into a three-dimensional landscape that his dreaming body understood how to navigate in ways his waking self had never imagined. When the morning came, it came grey and ordinary through the gap in the curtains, and Peter lay in his bed for a moment in the transitional state between sleep and waking that usually takes a few seconds to resolve, and found that it resolved differently than it had ever resolved before. His awareness of the room was immediate and total in a way that was startling, every surface and object present to him with an acuity of detail that the ordinary morning delivered gradually and incompletely. He could hear May downstairs in the kitchen with a clarity that should not have been possible through a floor and a ceiling and the ambient sounds of a queen's morning. He could smell coffee and the particular smell of toast at the exact moment it transitions from warm bread to something beginning to char. He sat up and reached for his glasses on the nightstand and found, when he put them on, that the room went strange and wrong in a way that it had not gone wrong the previous morning. He took them off, and the room resolved itself into perfect clarity, every edge sharp and every distance accurate, without the assistance of the lenses that had been mediating his relationship with the visual world for as long as he could remember. He put the glasses on again and took them off again, twice, because he was a scientifically minded person, and single observations are not sufficient to establish the reality of a phenomenon, and then he set them down on the nightstand and sat with the remarkable fact of a world that had sharpened itself overnight into something he could see without help. The headboard was where he discovered the strength, or rather, where the strength discovered him, because he had not gone looking for it. He pushed himself up from the pillow with his left hand braced against the headboard in the ordinary way, and the wood gave under his palm with a soft, yielding resistance, the way balsa wood gives, or foam, and when he pulled his hand away, the impressions of his fingers remained in the solid oak like signatures pressed into wax. He looked at his hand, and then at the headboard, and then at his hand again, and the scientific part of his mind, which never entirely stopped functioning regardless of what was happening to the rest of him, began noting variables and considering explanations, while the rest of him simply sat in the particular silence of someone who has just understood that the world has changed in a way that cannot be unchanged. He spent the morning alone in his room, moving through careful experiments in the methodical way that his training and his nature both inclined him toward, testing each new capability with the deliberate attention of someone who wants accurate data rather than dramatic confirmation. The wall held him. Not partially, not as a temporary anomaly that resolved itself when examined more closely, but completely and consistently and without apparent strain, his body adhering to the vertical surface with a matter-of-fact reliability that suggested this was simply something bodies did now, or at least that this body did now. He moved along the wall, and then across the ceiling, and the ceiling was no different from the wall, and the geometry of the room from that angle was so different from any geometry he had previously inhabited that he stayed up there for several minutes simply adjusting to the strangeness of it. The familiar furniture below him rearranged by perspective into something that required new categories of understanding. Through all of it he was quiet, and this is the thing worth holding on to as we move through the story of what came after. Not the powers themselves, which were extraordinary and which would shape everything that followed, but the quietness. The solitude of the discovery. The way the most significant morning of his life unfolded in a bedroom in Queens with no witness but himself, his careful hands pressing against walls and ceilings, his scientific mind cataloguing what it found, and the house continuing below him in its ordinary morning way, entirely unaware that anything had changed. The days that followed the morning of discovery had a quality that Peter would later find difficult to describe, even to himself, because the language available for extraordinary experiences tends to be borrowed from contexts that do not quite fit. He was not euphoric exactly, though there were moments of something close to it, a physical aliveness that made the ordinary textures of his days feel newly interesting and newly strange. He was not frightened exactly, though there were moments of that too, a late-night awareness of the gap between what he had been and what he was becoming that opened briefly in his chest before he closed it again, with the patient practicality that was one of his most reliable inner resources. What he was, most consistently and most privately, was alone with it, and the aloneness had a particular character that was neither entirely comfortable nor entirely uncomfortable, but simply the condition inside which everything else was happening. School continued, because school was the kind of institution that continued regardless of what was happening to the people inside it. Peter sat in his classes and took his notes and answered questions when called upon, and ate his lunch in the usual configuration of himself and the one or two other students whose orbit occasionally intersected with his, and none of it looked different from the outside than it had looked the week before. The difference was entirely interior, a constant low-level awareness of the new capacities moving through his body like a current, the spider sense registering the positions and movements of the people around him with an accuracy that was simultaneously useful and somewhat overwhelming until he learned to modulate his attention to it, the way you learn to modulate your attention to any new source of information until it takes its appropriate place in the hierarchy of things worth noticing. It was in the evenings, in the privacy of his bedroom after the household had settled into its nighttime rhythms, that Peter began the more deliberate work of understanding what he had become and what, if anything, he was going to do about it. He had a notebook that he kept separate from his school notebooks, its cover unremarkable, its pages filling gradually with observations and measurements, and the careful speculative reasoning of someone applying genuine scientific method to the unprecedented data of his own transformed physiology. He recorded what he could lift, expressed in terms of the objects available to him in his bedroom and the approximate weights he could estimate for them. He recorded the acuity of his senses, testing the range of his hearing by listening for specific sounds in the house and the street, and noting how they compared to what should have been audible at those distances. He recorded the spider sense in the limited vocabulary available for describing something that had no precise precedent, noting the quality of the awareness it produced and the accuracy of the information it seemed to convey. The web shooters began as a problem he set himself one evening in early autumn, 3 weeks after the bite, when the logic of what he was and what he could do had clarified enough in his mind to suggest the obvious gap. He could climb anything. He could move with a speed and agility that no human body should have been capable of. He was stronger than any person his size had any physiological right to be. But to move through the city the way his mind was already beginning to imagine moving through it, the three-dimensional freedom that his dreams had sketched for him in the weeks since the transformation, he needed something to move on. He needed a line, a connection between himself and the architecture around him, something he could trust with his weight and his velocity, and the specific demands of a body that was no longer operating within ordinary human parameters. He worked on the formula for the web fluid first, because the mechanical problem of the shooters was more straightforward than the chemical problem of the fluid itself, and because chemistry was the domain where his confidence was highest, and his existing knowledge most directly applicable. The desk in his bedroom became a laboratory of a kind that it had always partially been, but the work now had a focus and an urgency that his previous experiments, however genuinely interesting to him, had not possessed. He worked from first principles, reasoning through what properties the fluid would need to have, the tensile strength required to bear his weight at speed, the adhesive quality necessary to anchor to the variety of surfaces the city provided, the degradation rate that would allow it to function long enough to be useful, without leaving permanent evidence of his passage across buildings and bridges, and the stoned faces of whatever the city offered to swing between. The formula went through many iterations, each one recorded in the private notebook with the same careful attention he brought to his school assignments. The failed attempts noted alongside the successful ones, because a scientist who only records successes is not doing science but something closer to storytelling. Several early versions were too brittle, snapping under the load he needed them to bear. Several were too adhesive, bonding to surfaces with a permanence that made retrieval impossible, and would have left a trail of evidence across the rooftops of Queens that would have raised questions he was not yet prepared to answer. One version dissolved too quickly, which he discovered in a manner that was undignified enough that he was grateful for the privacy of his bedroom when it happened. The version he eventually arrived at after approximately 3 weeks of evening work had the right balance of strength and flexibility and the degradation rate he needed, dissolving cleanly after approximately 1 hour of exposure, leaving nothing behind that could not be attributed to ordinary environmental residue. The mechanical design of the shooters was a different kind of problem, more immediately satisfying in the way that engineering problems tend to be more immediately satisfying than chemical ones, offering clearer feedback at each stage of iteration and a more tangible sense of progress as each component moved closer to working. He made them small enough to fit on his wrists beneath a long sleeve, which was a constraint he had established early because the concealment problem was one he was already thinking about, with the methodical attention he brought to problems that mattered. The trigger mechanism went through several designs before he arrived at one that could be activated by the specific pressure of his middle and ring fingers pressed together, a motion distinctive enough from ordinary hand movements that it would not fire accidentally but natural enough that it could be executed quickly and without conscious deliberation once the muscle memory was established. He tested the completed shooters for the first time on a Saturday afternoon, when Ben and May had gone together to visit friends in another part of the borough, which gave him the house and the small backyard to himself for several hours. He stood in the backyard in old clothes and aimed at the fence along the property's edge, and pressed the trigger and watched the web fluid arc across the space and attach to the wood with the clean authority of something that had been designed correctly and had performed as designed. He spent the afternoon in the backyard shooting at various targets, adjusting the aperture settings on the shooters to produce different volumes and configurations of fluid, learning the feel of the mechanism in his hands until it stopped requiring conscious attention and started becoming something more like instinct. The costume arrived at the problem differently than the shooters had, because the costume was not primarily a technical problem but something closer to a psychological one, and Peter spent longer working out what he wanted it to be than he spent actually making it. He knew from the beginning that he needed something to wear, not just for the practical reason of concealment, though that reason was real and important, but for a reason he found harder to articulate with the same precision he could bring to the fluid formula or the trigger mechanism. Something about the distinction between Peter Parker in his school clothes, awkward and invisible and the target of Flash Thompson's casual cruelty, and whatever he was going to be in the evenings and nights when he took his new capabilities out into the city, required a visible form. The difference needed to exist somewhere outside his own awareness, needed to be something he could put on and take off, so that the two versions of himself had a boundary between them that he could navigate deliberately, rather than blurring together in a way that might make both of them less coherent. He thought about this for several evenings before he touched any materials, sitting at his desk with his chin in his hand in the posture his teachers would have recognized as his thinking posture, though they had only ever seen it directed at chemistry problems and algebra and the particular pleasures of theoretical physics. He thought about what the costume needed to do and what it needed to mean, and the meaning mattered to him in a way that he acknowledged privately and would not have admitted publicly, because he was 15, and public admissions of caring about meaning were socially costly at 15 in ways they would eventually, much later, stop being. The colours came first, before anything else, because colour was the most immediately communicative element of the design and the one that would determine everything else's emotional register. He thought about what he wanted the costume to say, not to other people exactly, though other people would eventually see it, but to himself, in the moment of putting it on. He thought about what colours meant in the context of what he was and what he was doing, and he arrived at red and blue through a process of elimination and intuition that he could not have fully reconstructed afterward, but that felt when he arrived at it, like the right answer to a question he had been asking without quite knowing he was asking it. Red for something that was not quite boldness, not in the traditional sense, but for the visibility of it, the refusal to be invisible that was both deeply unfamiliar to Peter Parker and, he was beginning to understand, deeply necessary to whatever he was in the process of becoming. Blue for something steadier and quieter that balanced the red, that said something about the night and the city and the particular quality of calm attention he brought to problems worth solving. The web pattern came from the obvious source and satisfied the scientific part of his mind that appreciated solutions that drew their logic from the nature of the problem rather than imposing an arbitrary aesthetic on top of it. He was a person whose abilities derived from a spider. The web was honest in a way that more elaborate or symbolic designs would not have been. He drew it on paper first, working out the geometry until it satisfied him, and then transferred it to the fabric with the careful, slow attention of someone who wanted to get it right the first time. The mask was the element he spent the longest time with, both in the planning and in the making. Because the mask was the most psychologically significant component and he knew it. It needed to cover enough of his face that recognition was impossible under ordinary circumstances, which eliminated the small domino-style masks he had seen in the illustrated adventure stories of his childhood as insufficient for any serious purpose. It needed to allow him to breathe and to see with the full range of his enhanced vision which imposed technical constraints on the materials and the coverage area. But beyond the practical requirements, the mask needed to feel right in a way that he struggled to define and kept returning to as the deciding criterion whenever two otherwise equivalent options presented themselves. He made the first version of the full costume on a Friday night in late October, the house quiet around him. The materials spread across his desk in the careful arrangement of someone who has planned the work thoroughly and wants the execution to match the planning. He sewed slowly and with the focused patience that his teachers would have recognized, the patience of a student who cares about the result rather than the speed of arrival. The stitching was not professional, could not have been mistaken for the work of someone who sewed regularly, but it was careful, and it held. And when he was finished, he had something that resembled, in its general architecture and its colour and its pattern, the vision he had been carrying in his mind for the preceding weeks. He put it on for the first time, standing in front of the small mirror on the back of his bedroom door, and the silence in the room during the several minutes that followed was of the particular quality that accompanies genuine surprise. Even surprise that you have to some extent anticipated. The person in the mirror was not Peter Parker in any register that his classmates would have recognized. The costume covered everything that the Parker identity was built on, the glasses he no longer needed, the particular set of his face in its habitual expressions, the body language of someone accustomed to making himself smaller than he was. What it offered instead was a shape that suggested capability without announcing it, the web pattern giving the eye something to follow, the colours holding their balance of bold and quiet. He stood in front of the mirror for a long time and felt something that he did not have a name for at 15, though the word that would eventually attach itself to the feeling was simply this: readiness. The early nights out were tentative in the way that first attempts at anything genuinely new are tentative, full of the careful, questioning quality of someone learning the grammar of a language by speaking it rather than studying it in advance. He stayed close to his own neighbourhood at first, moving across the rooftops of the streets he had walked his whole life, and finding them transformed by altitude and speed into a landscape that bore the same relationship to the familiar as a beloved piece of music heard in a new arrangement, recognisable in its structure and entirely different in its feeling. The city from above was something he had never had access to before, and he moved through it with the unhurried attention of someone who is not yet in a hurry, because the thing they are doing is new enough that the doing of it is itself the point. He swung between buildings on weekday evenings after dinner, telling Aunt May he was going to the library or to a study session with a classmate whose name he invented with the small, guilty efficiency of someone who dislikes lying but has concluded that the alternative is not yet available to him. He came home and folded the costume into the hollowed-out space in the back of his desk drawer that he had prepared for exactly this purpose, and he sat down to the homework he had genuinely also meant to do, and the house around him was warm and ordinary and entirely unaware of what the evening had contained. He did not yet call himself anything in particular during these early weeks, which is to say the name existed in his mind but had not been spoken aloud or written down in any context that made it real in the way that named things are real. He was still working out what the name meant and what it required of the person who used it, turning it over in the private laboratory of his interior life with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. The name, when it finally settled into place with the solid authority of something correctly arrived at, was less a decision than a recognition, the identification of something that had already been true for a while before he found the language for it. What those early evenings gave him, before responsibility arrived to give them a different kind of weight, was something genuinely new in his experience, a version of freedom that had no precedent in the life of Peter Parker, the invisible boy from Queens. He moved through the city, and the city could not diminish him, could not seat him at the wrong lunch table or laugh at the wrong moment, or make him feel like the least important person in whatever room he happened to occupy. Up on the rooftops, in the costume, with the web line singing taut between his hand and the stone face of the building across the street, he was exactly as significant as his abilities made him. Which was to say considerably more significant than the social arithmetic of Midtown High had ever managed to calculate. There was a pleasure in this that he allowed himself to feel fully and without apology in those early weeks, before the weight arrived and changed the nature of what he was doing and why. It would not last in this uncomplicated form, and some part of him understood this even then, but it was real while it lasted, and it was his, and the rooftops of Queens held it gently in the particular darkness of those autumn nights. The freedom of those early autumn rooftops did not last in its uncomplicated form, as Peter had understood on some level it would not, and the thing that ended it was not a villain or a catastrophe in the operatic sense, but something quieter and more permanent, the kind of ending that announces itself only in retrospect. When you look back at a particular ordinary evening and understand that it was the last one of its kind, the last evening that belonged entirely to the uncomplicated version of things was a Thursday in November, and it was, by every available measure, a thoroughly ordinary evening in the Parker household, which is to say it was warm and specific and full of the small textures that Ben and May generated simply by being themselves in the spaces they inhabited, and Peter moved through it with the divided attention of someone who was present and also elsewhere, already partly given over to the plans he was making for later that night, the particular rooftop route he'd been thinking about, the new variation on his swing technique he wanted to test in the wider corridors between the taller buildings. Ben had come home from work in the mid-afternoon, which was unusual. A variation in the household's routine that Peter registered without asking about directly, because Ben's expression carried nothing alarming in it, only the mild, settled quality of a man whose day had ended earlier than expected, and who was not unhappy about this. He had changed out of his work clothes and gone down to the workshop for a while, and the sounds that came up through the kitchen floor were the familiar sounds of that space, the particular rhythms of a man working with his hands on something that did not require urgency, the occasional slide of a drawer, the soft knock of wood against the workbench, the unhurried quality of time being spent rather than used. May had made soup, the kind she made in the colder months with whatever was available, and a patience that transformed availability into something better than the sum of its components, and the smell of it moved through the house in the way that good smells move through small houses in cold weather, reaching every room and making each one feel slightly more like itself. Dinner was the three of them at the kitchen table, which it almost always was, and the conversation moved in the way it moved on evenings when no particular event required discussion, lightly and without destination, touching on the small events of 3 separate days and finding in the touching a pleasure that had nothing to do with the significance of any individual item. Ben had a story about something that had happened at the hardware store where he had stopped on the way home, a small, absurd misunderstanding involving 2 customers and a very specific type of screw fitting that had resulted in a conversation of sufficient comedic confusion that he had been thinking about it with private amusement for the better part of the afternoon. He told it in the way he told things, without hurrying toward the funny part, letting the setup do its work, and May laughed at the right moment with the genuine laughter of someone who has laughed at the same person's stories for many years and finds them still worth laughing at, which is a form of love that does not get enough recognition. Peter laughed too, and the laugh was real, and he was present at the table in the way he was genuinely capable of being present, when the competing pull of the costume and the rooftops was not too strong. He ate the soup and answered May's questions about his week at school, with the honest portions of the truth that were available for sharing, and the vague, deflecting portions that had become second nature to him over the preceding weeks, and Ben listened to all of it with the particular quality of listening he brought to conversations with Peter. Not passive exactly, but not interrogative either, the listening of someone who trusted the person they were listening to, and communicated that trust through the simple act of paying attention, without demanding anything specific in return. After dinner, Peter helped May clear the table, which he did most evenings, the small domestic ritual of carrying plates to the sink and wiping down the oilcloth that covered the kitchen table, a gesture so habitual that it existed below the level of decision, simply something that happened because it was the kind of household where these things happened. Ben went to the living room and settled into the chair that was his chair, in the way that certain pieces of furniture become associated with certain people through years of consistent use, and the sound of the television came on at the low volume he preferred, the news, which he watched with the engaged skepticism of someone who believed in staying informed but did not mistake being informed for being certain. Peter went upstairs to his room and sat at his desk and opened the homework he'd brought home from school, and he worked through it with the efficient attention he always brought to schoolwork, not because the work itself was particularly demanding, but because he had learned early that the fastest path through necessary tasks was direct and focused engagement, rather than the prolonged, distracted half-effort that turned an hour's work into 3 hours of misery. He finished in approximately 45 minutes and sat for a moment in the particular stillness that follows the completion of an obligation, the small clearing of cognitive space that happens when a thing that needed doing has been done. He was thinking about the rooftop route he had planned when he heard Ben's footsteps on the stairs, which was not unusual. Ben sometimes came up in the evenings to say goodnight or to share something he'd seen on the news that he thought Peter might find interesting, and Peter turned in his chair with the expectation of one of these ordinary exchanges. But Ben came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, in the way he sometimes did when he had something specific he wanted to say, not urgently, not with any quality of alarm, but with the settled intention of someone who has been thinking about a thing and has decided that now is the right time to say it. What Ben said was not a speech. Ben Parker was not a man who made speeches, distrusting the performance of wisdom in favour of its quiet application, and the things he said to Peter on that Thursday evening were said in the same conversational tone he used for everything, without underlining or dramatic emphasis. The way genuinely important things are often said by people who understand that importance does not require announcement. He talked for a while about something he had noticed in Peter over the preceding weeks, not accusingly, not with any specific reference to what he could not possibly have known about the costume and the rooftops, but in the general terms of a man who paid attention to the person he was raising and had observed a change in the quality of that person's engagement with the world around him. Something had shifted in Peter, Ben said, something he could not name precisely, but which presented itself in the way Peter moved through the house. A new confidence that Ben was glad to see, alongside something else harder to identify, a quality of separateness that he wanted to mention not to challenge, but simply to name, because naming things was the first step toward understanding them. And then he said the thing that he sometimes said, not for the first time, but on this particular evening with a weight and specificity that the previous iterations had not carried, about power and responsibility, about the relationship between what a person is capable of doing and what a person is therefore obligated to consider. He did not connect this observation to anything concrete because he had no concrete connection to make. He said it in the abstract, in the way of a man passing along something he had come to understand through his own experience of living, and Peter listened to it in the way he had listened to it before, with the respectful attention of someone who loves the person speaking and recognizes the sincerity of the offering, even when the full significance of it has not yet arrived. Ben said good night and went back downstairs, and Peter sat at his desk in the quiet that followed and thought about what had been said, in the way he thought about things, thoroughly and without hurry, turning it in his mind and examining its facets. He thought he understood it. He thought it was good advice, the kind of solid, grounded wisdom that Ben reliably produced, and he filed it in the part of himself where he kept things that were worth returning to. He did not understand yet that he was going to need it in a way that would make the word need feel entirely inadequate, that the thing Ben had just told him was going to become the architecture of the rest of his life, rather than simply a piece of useful guidance to be considered and applied in moderation. He went out that night later, after the house had gone fully quiet and the light under Ben and May's door had been dark for long enough that he could move through the hallway without risk of encounter. He went out in the costume, down the drain pipe on the side of the house that he had determined would bear his weight reliably, and which deposited him in the side alley from which he could reach the rooftops within approximately 90 seconds. He swung through the October dark with the ease that was becoming familiar without yet becoming ordinary, still capable of producing in him the specific physical pleasure of a body doing something it was designed to do, and the city spread around and below him in its nighttime configuration, indifferent and vast and full of the simultaneous private lives of millions of people, each one as complete and complex as his own. He came home in the early hours of the morning and climbed back up the drain pipe and moved through the quiet house and into his room and folded the costume back into the desk drawer with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this enough times to have developed a system for it. He slept well and dreamlessly, the sleep of a body that has been thoroughly used and is taking the opportunity to restore itself, and the house was quiet around him, and May's garden was frost-touched in the early light, and Ben's chair in the living room held the particular quality of absence that familiar objects develop when the person associated with them is temporarily elsewhere, which is not a heavy absence, not the absence of loss. Just the ordinary absence of someone who will be back. That was Thursday. The call came on Friday evening. The hours between Thursday night and Friday evening exist in Peter's memory as a series of ordinary images that the subsequent event would permanently alter in their emotional register, not changing what they contained but changing what they meant, the way a piece of music acquires a different quality when you learn it was the last thing someone heard before something happened. Friday morning was school, and school was the texture it always was, and Peter moved through it in the ordinary configuration of himself, slightly distracted, thinking about a chemistry problem he was working through in his private notebook, managing the social landscape of Midtown High with the habitual, unconscious competence of long practice. He came home in the afternoon, and May was in the kitchen and the house smelled of something baking, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window at the angle it came through in November, low and golden and brief. He had a snack at the kitchen table, and May talked about the neighbour's cat, which had developed a habit of sitting in the garden and regarding May's work there with an expression that she found either contemplative or judgmental, and could not decide which. And Peter laughed at this in the genuine way that May always managed to produce in him without apparent effort, and then he went upstairs to his room, and his desk and his private notebook, and the ongoing chemical problem that was occupying the part of his mind not needed for other things. Ben was supposed to be home by 6. This was a Friday pattern, Ben working until late afternoon and returning for a dinner that May scheduled around this expectation. 6 o'clock passed, and Peter registered it as a background fact, the kind of minor schedule deviation that does not initially produce alarm because schedule deviations are common and usually resolve themselves within a reasonable interval. May noted it in the kitchen with the mild, practical attention of someone running a household that depends on a degree of coordination, checking the clock and adjusting the timing of the stove accordingly, without yet adding any emotional weight to the observation. At approximately 7:15 the phone rang, and May answered it in the kitchen, in the ordinary way she answered the phone, and then her voice changed. The change in her voice was the first thing, and it reached Peter at his desk upstairs before any specific word did, the way a shift in air pressure reaches you before the weather it announces. He was up from the chair before he had consciously decided to move. Because the body understands certain qualities of sound before the mind has assembled them into meaning, and he was at the top of the stairs by the time May had said the second or third sentence of whatever she was saying, and he heard enough in those sentences to know that he needed to come down, and he came down. The police officer at the hospital was kind in the way of someone trained to deliver information of this kind to families, careful and direct in equal measure, using the specific vocabulary that has been developed for these moments, because ordinary language is not adequate to them, and something more formal provides a small amount of protective distance for everyone in the room. Ben had been at the warehouse, the one where he sometimes picked up evening security shifts when the regular man was unavailable. There had been a break-in. There had been a confrontation. The rest of the officer's words arrived in the sequence they arrived in, and May sat down in the kitchen chair nearest to her, and Peter stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, and felt the floor of everything shift beneath him in the way that floors shift when the thing they were built on is no longer there. The drive to the hospital was May's neighbour, who had appeared at the door with the quiet competence of someone who has understood, without being told, that a situation requires a practical response, and has decided to provide one. May sat in the front seat with her hands in her lap and did not speak, and Peter sat in the back and watched the streets of Queens pass outside the window, the ordinary Friday evening streets full of people moving through their ordinary Friday evenings, and the gap between what the streets contained and what had just happened to the world seemed to him in that moment almost incomprehensible. That the city could continue in its ordinary configuration while the architecture of everything he had taken for granted was in the process of collapsing. The doctor at the hospital said the things that doctors say when there is nothing to be done, and everything has already happened, and the only remaining task is the terrible one of telling people who love someone that the someone is gone. Ben had died before the ambulance arrived. This was said with the gentleness of someone who understood that gentleness in these moments is the only gift available to the person delivering the news, and May received it with a stillness that was so complete and so unlike her usual animated presence that Peter did not know how to be in the same room with it, did not know where to put himself or his hands or the thing that was happening inside him that did not yet have a shape he recognized. He stepped outside into the hospital corridor and stood against the wall and breathed. and the corridor was bright with the specific brightness of institutional spaces that do not acknowledge the difference between night and day. And somewhere down the hall, someone was being paged over the intercom in the flat, procedural voice of an institution continuing its business. And Peter stood against the wall and understood, with the terrible clarity that grief sometimes produces before it produces anything else, that he had been in the building where the thief was. He had been there. He had let the man go. He had stepped aside and let a man run past him who had then, on that same evening, gone to a warehouse and taken a life that Peter Parker loved more than almost anything in the world. The web shooter was on his wrist beneath his jacket sleeve. He had worn it out of habit, the same habit that had made it so easy to be Spider-Man for these past weeks, and he felt it there against his skin with a weight that was entirely out of proportion to its physical dimensions. The weight of something that could have been used and was not. The weight of capability withheld at the wrong moment for the wrong reasons. He stood in the hospital corridor and felt the shape of what Ben had told him the evening before begin its long, irrevocable settling into the deepest place inside him, and the words arrived not as comfort but as verdict, with the terrible precision of something understood too late and at too great a cost. The walk home from the hospital later, after the neighbours had come and the first hours of practical grief management had produced their small necessary tasks, and May had been settled with the gentle, relentless care of a woman who had just lost the person she had organised her life around for decades, Peter took a loan, telling May's neighbour that he needed the air and walking into the Queen's night in the ordinary clothes of Peter Parker, with the web shooter still on his wrist and the city continuing its indifferent Friday around him. He walked for a long time through streets he knew so thoroughly that his feet managed them without instruction, past the hardware store where Ben had stopped on Thursday, past the school, past the corner where he and Ben had once stood for 20 minutes discussing the correct approach to a particularly stubborn bicycle repair, and the streets held all of these memories in their surfaces the way streets do, indifferently and permanently, unchanged by the fact that the world had reorganized itself around an absence. He did not go out as Spider-Man that night. He went home and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark and held the costume in his hands, and felt the weight of what it represented, and what it had failed to represent on the one evening when representation mattered most. The rooftops of Queens were out there in the November dark, exactly as they had been the night before, exactly as they would be tomorrow, and the city was full of its ordinary darkness and its ordinary dangers and its ordinary need for someone to care about the difference between what was happening to people and what should be happening to people. He sat with the costume for a long time, and then, with the quiet, irrevocable intention of someone who has just understood what they are for, he began to fold it carefully, the way you fold something you are going to need. There are people in every life who do their most important work without ever being recognized for it, whose contributions to the shape of things exist so thoroughly in the background of events that the events themselves seem to happen independently, without visible support, when in fact they happen because of a steady, unglamorous, entirely devoted presence that asked for nothing in return and received very little in the way of acknowledgement. May Parker was this kind of person in the story of Spider-Man, which is to say she was this kind of person in the story of Peter Parker, which is to say she was this kind of person in the only story that ultimately mattered, the one that happened inside the house on Ingram Street over the course of years that accumulated their meaning quietly, without headlines or photographs or any external record adequate to what they actually contained. She had known something was different about her nephew from the first morning after the field trip, though she would not have used the word known if asked, preferring something softer and more honest, something like felt or noticed in the way you notice weather before you can name what kind it is. She had brought him the aspirin and the soup and the cool cloth for his forehead, and she had sat on the edge of his bed in the way she sat on the edge of his bed when he was unwell, which was the way of someone for whom the act of sitting beside a sick child was its own sufficient purpose, requiring no supplementary activity or conversation to justify the time spent. She had watched his face while he slept, and she had seen something in the quality of his sleep that was different from the sleep of ordinary illness, something more active and more interior than the flat, depleted unconsciousness of a child with a fever, and she had noted this observation in the private ledger she kept about Peter's well-being without drawing any conclusions from it, because conclusions from insufficient evidence were not her habit. The changes in the days that followed were small enough that a less attentive person would have attributed them entirely to the ordinary processes of adolescent development and thought no more about them. May was not a less attentive person. She noticed that he was no longer wearing his glasses, which he explained by telling her that his eyes had apparently corrected themselves. A thing she had not previously heard of occurring spontaneously in a teenager, but which the optometrist she took him to see confirmed with a puzzled equanimity that suggested he found it unusual but not impossible. She noticed that he moved differently, with a new quality of physical confidence that expressed itself not in swagger or performance, but in the simple, unself-conscious way he navigated space, no longer bumping into things, no longer carrying his body with the slight apologetic hunch of someone who had learned that taking up space tended to attract unwanted attention. She noticed that he ate more, considerably more, with an appetite that she accommodated without comment by quietly increasing what she kept in the house, because feeding people was one of the primary languages in which she expressed care, and the opportunity to exercise it at larger scale was not something she experienced as a burden. She noticed the absences, which began before Ben died and continued with greater frequency and longer duration afterward. Peter had always been a boy with a certain degree of mystery to him, an interior life clearly richer and more complex than what he chose to share, and May had always respected this as a basic feature of his character rather than a problem to be solved. But the absences were different from interior complexity, were something more actively organised, involving the specific logistical work of explaining where he was going and when he would return in ways that were technically accurate and substantively incomplete, and May heard the incompleteness in these explanations with the ear of someone who had been listening to Peter since before he could form sentences and understood the particular quality of his voice when it was telling only part of a thing. She did not ask him directly. This requires explanation, because the decision not to ask directly was not a passive one. Not the result of avoidance or discomfort with difficult conversations, but the product of a specific and considered understanding of her nephew that she had developed over 15 years of close and loving attention. May Parker understood, in the way that people who truly know another person understand things about them that cannot be fully articulated, that Peter's secrets were not the secrets of a boy in trouble, or a boy making dangerous choices in the ordinary adolescent sense. They were the secrets of someone carrying something large and serious and self-imposed, something that he had taken on out of a genuine sense of obligation, rather than out of any desire to deceive the people who loved him. She understood this without being able to name what the something was, the way you can understand the emotional truth of a piece of music without being able to read the notation. The decision to give him the space his secret required was one of the most difficult things May Parker ever did, and it was a decision she renewed quietly every day across many years, because it required the ongoing suppression of a maternal instinct toward protection that was among the strongest forces in her nature. She wanted to know. She wanted to sit him down and ask him to tell her everything, and receive the full account of his double life, and absorb its implications and help him carry it in whatever way a person can help someone carry something that was always going to be fundamentally solitary. She wanted this with an ache that was physical in its specificity, located somewhere in the chest, and she set it aside every morning and got up and made breakfast, and was present in the ways she was capable of being present, without crossing the line that she had determined, through careful and painful reasoning, he needed her not to cross. What she did instead was love him with a completeness and consistency that would have made the secrets unnecessary if secrets had ever been about love rather than about protection, which they were, which she understood, which she accepted with the grace of someone who had been forced by circumstance to become fluent in forms of acceptance that most people are never required to learn. She made his meals and washed his clothes and kept the house in the particular order that communicated stability and continuity, and she asked about his days at school with genuine interest, and listened to the answers with the same genuine interest, and she pretended not to notice the things she noticed, while noticing all of them with perfect fidelity, banking the observations in the private ledger without ever presenting the account for settlement. The injuries began not long after Ben died, which was not a coincidence that May failed to register, though she registered it without connecting it to any specific conclusion that would have required her to act differently. They were small at first, the kind of minor abrasions and bruises that an active teenage boy might acquire through ordinary means, but they had a character that distinguished them from ordinary teenage injuries, appearing on parts of the body that ordinary activities did not typically mark, healing faster than injuries of their apparent severity should have healed, carrying a quality of deliberateness that was difficult to define but impossible, once noticed, to unnotice. May noticed them when she collected his laundry, when she saw him wince at the wrong moment during an ordinary movement, when she caught a glimpse of something fading on his forearm as he reached past her in the kitchen. She said nothing. She kept the first aid kit fully stocked, and she made sure he knew where it was, and she said nothing. The nights were the particular territory of her worry, which is the territory that worry most naturally inhabits when the person you love is out in the world in ways you cannot monitor. May slept lightly in the years after Ben died, not from insomnia exactly, but from the adjustment her nervous system made to the sudden removal of the other warm presence in the bed, the recalibration of a body that had organised its sleep around a companionable human weight for decades, and now encountered only the flat, cool expanse of the other side of the mattress. In this lighter sleep she heard things, the house settling, the street outside in its nighttime configurations, and sometimes, at hours that no reasonable explanation for a teenager's schedule could account for, the very soft, practiced sounds of someone moving through the house with the careful intention of not being heard. She heard these sounds and she lay still in the dark of her bedroom, and she did not call out or get up, or go to the hallway to confirm what she had heard. She lay still and she breathed, and she turned her face toward the ceiling and she spoke privately and without words to Ben, which was something she did regularly in the years after his death, not from any literal belief that he could hear her, but from the habit of a marriage long enough that the dialogue had become internal, woven into her own thinking so thoroughly that her thoughts about important things still arrived in the form of conversations with him. She told him, in this private and wordless way, that Peter was home, that she had heard him come in, that whatever he was doing out there in the city in the small hours of the morning he was doing carefully and coming back from consistently, and that she was frightened and that she trusted him, and that she did not know how to hold both of these things simultaneously, but that she was managing, that she was doing her best. The mornings after these nights were ordinary mornings, which was May's achievement rather than a natural consequence of the situation. She made breakfast and she was warm and she was present, and she asked Peter if he'd slept well, with the casual ease of someone asking a question to which she already had the answer, and did not intend to press for a more accurate one. Peter said that he had slept fine, and she said that was good, and she put the eggs on the plate and the toast in the rack and the orange juice in the glass that was his glass, and the kitchen was full of the morning light of whatever season it happened to be, and the day began in the way that days in that house had always begun, with warmth and food and the unhurried presence of two people who loved each other managing the ordinary business of getting through a morning together. She thought about Ben constantly, in the particular way that grief reshapes thinking over time, moving from the acute and overwhelming presence of fresh loss towards something more integrated and more permanent, less like a wound and more like a new organ, something you carry always that changes the function of everything adjacent to it, without preventing those adjacent things from continuing to work. She thought about what he would make of Peter now, of the person their nephew was becoming in the years after the bite and after the loss, and she thought that Ben would have known what she knew without being able to name it, that there was something serious and purposeful happening inside their boy, that the gifts being given to him were not going to waste, that whatever he was doing with the nights and the absences and the inexplicable bruises was not random or self-indulgent, but was connected to the deepest part of who he was, the part that Ben had spent 15 years carefully tending. She missed Ben with a steadiness that was its own form of love, a love that had not ended with his life, but had simply changed its mode of expression, no longer able to direct itself outward toward the person it was for, and so turning inward, becoming a quality of her own character rather than a transaction between two people. She missed the weight of him in the morning, and his voice at dinner, and the sounds from the workshop in the basement, and the specific way he had of sitting in his chair in the living room with the paper, comfortable in the way of a man who had made peace with the dimensions of his life a long time ago and found them sufficient. She missed being known by someone who had known her long enough that knowing required no effort, no performance, no translation of herself into something more communicable, just the simple ease of existing beside another person who understood you without needing to be told. She channeled this grief into the garden with the dedication that the garden repaid generously in the spring and summer months, producing quantities of flowers and vegetables that exceeded what any two-person household could reasonably consume, the excess distributed among neighbours with the matter-of-fact generosity that was May's natural mode of operating in the world. The garden was the space where she thought most clearly. Her hands in the soil, and her knees on the foam pad she used to protect them, and the light changing overhead as the morning moved toward afternoon. And in this space she had many of her most honest, private conversations with herself about Peter, and about the life she was trying to give him, and about whether she was doing it correctly in the absence of the person she had always done it with. She had opinions about the people who entered Peter's life, formed through the careful observation of someone who paid attention to the small behavioural details that revealed character more reliably than grand gestures or explicit self-presentation. She had reservations about certain of his acquaintances that she kept to herself because he had not asked for her assessment, and because she trusted, on the evidence of the person he was becoming, that his own judgment was developing into something adequate to the task of choosing his relationships. She had warm feelings about certain others that she expressed with the modulated enthusiasm of someone who understood that an aunt's approval was a complicated kind of endorsement for a teenager to receive and tried to calibrate her expressions of it accordingly. She worried about money in the practical, non-panicking way of someone who has managed limited resources across many years and has developed a relationship with financial constraint that is neither comfortable nor catastrophic, simply a condition to be navigated with care and ingenuity. The household income after Ben died was what it was, a combination of Ben's modest life insurance, her own part-time work, and the contributions Peter began making from what he described as freelance photography work, which she accepted with gratitude and without interrogation, because the interrogation would have required her to ask questions whose answers she was not ready to receive. She kept the accounts carefully, and she managed the house with the efficiency of a long practice, and she made sure that the table was always set for two at least, and usually for more when there were people to feed, because feeding people was something she understood how to do, and the doing of it was one of the ways she kept the house feeling like what it had always been, which was a place where love was the primary organising principle. The faith she had in Peter was not naive, which is important to understand. It was not the faith of someone who refused to see clearly, or who had constructed an idealised version of her nephew that the real Peter was required to live up to regardless of the evidence. It was the faith of someone who had watched a particular person develop over a long period of time and had accumulated sufficient evidence of that person's character to make an informed assessment, and whose informed assessment was that Peter Benjamin Parker was a fundamentally good person who was doing his best with an extraordinary situation in the only way his nature allowed him to do it, which was seriously and responsibly and with a consistent awareness of the effects of his choices on the people around him. She did not need to know the details to trust the substance. This was the most sophisticated thing May Parker understood, and she understood it in the practical rather than the philosophical register. Lived it every day in the kitchen and the garden and the quiet evenings in the house on Ingram Street, where she and Peter ate dinner together and talked about the small events of their days, and found in the conversation the particular comfort of two people who love each other, maintaining the rituals of that love across all the distance that the secret between them created and could never, in the nature of things, entirely close. She prayed for him, in the concrete and unself-conscious way of someone for whom prayer was a genuine practice rather than a performance, saying the specific words to the specific listening presence she'd been addressing since childhood, with the matter-of-fact faith of someone who had received enough evidence of that presence's reality to continue the relationship without requiring periodic reconfirmation. She prayed for his safety, which was the most specific and urgent part of the prayer, and she prayed for his happiness, which she understood was a more complex thing to ask for than safety, and which she approached accordingly, and she prayed for Ben, which was a different kind of prayer, less petition than conversation, the ongoing dialogue of someone who had not stopped talking to the person they loved simply because that person was no longer in the room. In the mornings, she got up before Peter and she made the coffee, and she stood at the kitchen window in the early light, and she looked at the garden, and she thought about the day ahead, and she was, in the most honest available accounting, all right. Not happy in the uncomplicated way of someone whose life contains only things they chose and welcomes them, but all right in the deeper, harder way of someone who has accepted the life they actually have and found within its actual dimensions enough love and purpose and small daily beauty to constitute something worth being grateful for. She thought Ben would have recognized this, the quality of being all right in the real sense rather than the performed sense, and she thought he would have been glad of it, and she turned from the window and poured the coffee and waited for the sound of Peter's feet on the stairs, and the house held itself quietly around her in the early light, doing what it had always done, which was to be the place where the most important things happened, the things nobody photographed, the things that made everything else possible. The arrangement Peter eventually arrived at with the Daily Bugle was, when examined from a certain angle, one of the more quietly absurd situations that any person has ever voluntarily constructed for themselves, and Peter was aware of this absurdity from the beginning, carrying it as a private source of wry amusement that helped offset the considerable practical difficulties the arrangement also produced. He was selling photographs of himself to a newspaper whose publisher had made the condemnation of the person in those photographs a central feature of his professional identity. He was providing the primary visual documentation of a figure that the same publisher described in print, with consistent and creative regularity, as a menace, a vigilante, a costumed criminal, and a danger to the orderly functioning of civil society. He was, in the most literal available sense, funding his own defamation, and he did this every week, or as close to every week as the unpredictable nature of his activities allowed. Because the money was real, and the need for it was real, and the alternatives were considerably less available than the need, the practical problem that the photography arrangement solved was the one that had presented itself almost immediately after Peter accepted the full weight of what his nights as Spiderman were going to require of his days as Peter Parker. He could not hold a conventional job, which was the most obvious source of income available to a teenager in Queens without specialised credentials, because conventional jobs required a reliability of schedule that his other obligations made impossible to provide. He had missed too many shifts at too many theoretical part-time positions during the period of working this out. The grocery store where he had lasted 11 days before a particularly complex situation, involving a villain and a warehouse on the waterfront, had cost him an evening shift he could not explain his absence from. The diner where the same essential problem had repeated itself within the first week. The world of hourly employment was built around the assumption that the person doing the work would be present when the work was scheduled, and this assumption was incompatible with the demands of a life that routinely required him to be somewhere else, without advance notice, and without the ability to provide a satisfactory explanation for the change of plans. Photography had presented itself as the solution not through any elaborate reasoning, but through the practical logic of the situation itself, which was that Peter was the only person in New York City with consistent access to Spider-Man at close range and in circumstances that produced dramatic images, and that dramatic images of Spider-Man were something the city's newspapers demonstrably wanted. He had taken the first photographs almost experimentally, setting a small camera on a timer attached to a web line on a rooftop during a situation involving a warehouse robbery, and the results had been good enough that the experiment seemed worth developing into something more deliberate. He had improved his technique across the following weeks with the methodical attention he brought to all technical problems, developing a system of camera placement and timing that allowed him to capture genuinely useful images while simultaneously dealing with whatever situation had produced those images, a feat of divided attention that would have seemed implausible to any photographer who had not also been the subject of their own work. The first time he walked into the Daily Bugle offices, he was 16 years old and carrying a manila envelope of 8 by 10 photographs and wearing the expression of someone who had prepared for this conversation more thoroughly than the conversation ultimately required. The Bugle's offices occupied several floors of a building in Midtown Manhattan, and the reception area communicated the particular atmosphere of a place where news happened, which was to say an atmosphere of organised urgency, of people moving with purpose between places that all seemed to require their presence simultaneously, of phones ringing at intervals and voices carrying across open spaces with the unself-conscious volume of people accustomed to ambient noise. Peter stood at the reception desk and asked to speak to someone about freelance photographs, and was directed after a brief wait toward the city desk, where a harried editor looked at his photographs with the rapid, expert attention of someone who had looked at many thousands of photographs and developed the ability to assess their value in approximately 3 seconds per image. The editor's assessment of the photographs was positive in the restrained, transactional way of someone who did not want to overpay for something he needed. He asked where Peter had gotten them. Peter said he had taken them himself. The editor looked at Peter, who was 16 and slight, and wearing the slightly too large jacket that was his most professional available garment, and then looked back at the photographs, and the arithmetic of what Peter was claiming did not obviously resolve itself in his expression, but the photographs were good and the subject was one the paper's publisher had recently declared a priority for coverage, and the editor made an offer that was lower than the photograph's market value and higher than Peter's rent. Which was the relevant comparison? He accepted the offer and walked back out through the organised urgency of the newsroom and down the elevator to the street, and stood on the pavement for a moment in the particular state of someone who has just solved a practical problem that has been occupying considerable mental real estate and is experiencing the cognitive clearing that follows such a solution. The money in his pocket was real. The arrangement was replicable. The situation was absurd, and he allowed himself to appreciate the absurdity of it for approximately 30 seconds before putting it away in the compartment, where he kept things that were funny in the private register and returning his attention to the rest of the day. Betty Brant was at the reception desk on his second visit, which was approximately 2 weeks after the first. And she was the reason the second visit felt different from the first, in a way that was not entirely accounted for by the fact of having done it before. She was a few years older than Peter, with the particular quality of composure that develops in people who have had to manage difficult circumstances early and have discovered in the process that they are more capable than they previously knew. She handled the phones and the visitors and the various demands of a busy newspaper office with an efficiency that never tipped into coldness, maintaining a warmth toward the people she dealt with that suggested genuine interest rather than professional performance. When Peter presented himself at her desk with his envelope of photographs, she greeted him with the attention of someone who intended to be helpful, rather than simply procedurally correct, and the distinction was one that Peter, who had grown accustomed to being processed rather than noticed in most institutional contexts, registered with something approaching gratitude. She asked him questions about the photographs, not the transactional questions of someone gathering necessary information, but the curious questions of someone who found the subject genuinely interesting, and he answered them with the portions of the truth that were available to him, which required a degree of careful navigation that he was becoming practiced at, but which still demanded enough active attention that the conversation had a slightly effortful quality beneath its apparent ease. She did not seem to notice the effortfulness, or if she noticed it, she attributed it to the ordinary social uncertainty of a teenager talking to a young woman he found attractive, which was also true and which provided useful cover for the other kind of effort. She told him the editor's name and which days he was least likely to be managing a deadline crisis. Information that proved practically valuable and that she offered with the natural generosity of someone who helped people as a default rather than a considered choice. The relationship that developed between Peter and Betty across the following months was built on the accumulated substance of his regular visits to the Bugle offices, which occurred often enough to constitute a routine without quite becoming one, irregular enough in their scheduling that each visit had to re-establish its own footing. They talked about the photographs and then about other things, about the city and about the news and about the specific texture of working in a place where the events of the world arrived daily in raw form before being shaped into the version that appeared in print. Betty had opinions about this shaping process, about the distance between what actually happened and what the paper's coverage suggested had happened, and she expressed these opinions with a candour that surprised Peter, who had expected institutional loyalty from someone in her position, and received instead the honest assessment of someone who had thought carefully about the ethics of her situation and arrived at conclusions that cost her something to hold. He liked her for this, and for the way she treated him as a person whose thoughts on things were worth soliciting, which was not the universal experience of being 16 in rooms full of adults. He liked the specific quality of her attention when he was talking, which was the attention of someone who was actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to speak. A quality rarer than it should have been in his experience, and one he had come to value highly in the people he encountered. He was careful with his feelings about her, in the way he was careful with most things that mattered to him, holding them at a slight distance and examining them periodically to make sure they remained within the bounds of what the situation could reasonably support, which he understood was limited by the complications of his life, in ways that made anything more than friendship impractical and potentially unkind to her. Jonah Jameson entered Peter's awareness not gradually but all at once, in the manner of phenomena that are too large and too fully formed to be encountered in stages. The publisher of the Daily Bugle was a force of nature in the most literal available sense of that phrase, meaning that he was a natural occurrence rather than a constructed one, something that had developed according to its own internal logic over many years without any external shaping influence, powerful enough to significantly alter its trajectory. He was of middle age and considerable physical presence, with a moustache that communicated authority in the way that certain moustaches do, and he moved through the Bugle's offices with the proprietary energy of someone who had built the place, and consequently felt entitled to take up whatever portion of its atmosphere his mood required on any given day. His voice carried, his opinions carried further. Peter had expected, before he understood Jameson, to find the publisher's campaign against Spider-Man merely irritating in the way of someone saying untrue things about you in public. What he found instead was considerably more interesting and more psychologically complex than simple irritation, which was that Jameson's hatred of Spider-Man was genuine, rooted in something real about the man's character and history rather than in cynical opportunism or calculated sensationalism, though it served both of those purposes as well. Jameson had built his professional reputation on a particular theory of accountability, on the belief that public figures, people who operated in the public eye and claimed public trust, owed the public complete transparency about who they were and what they were doing and why. Spider-Man violated this principle in the most fundamental available way, hiding his identity behind a mask and operating outside any institutional structure that could be held accountable by the normal mechanisms of civic oversight. To Jameson, this was not a minor procedural complaint, but a genuine moral problem, and the sincerity of his conviction was what made his editorials so effective and so difficult to dismiss with the contempt that their specific accusations probably deserved. Peter thought about Jameson's arguments more carefully than most people in Spider-Man's position might have been expected to, because thinking carefully about arguments, including arguments that operated against his interests, was how he was built. He could see the internal logic of Jameson's position, could identify where it was genuinely reasonable and where it required assumptions that did not hold up under scrutiny, could follow the reasoning to the places where it broke down without being able to entirely refute the parts that did not break down. This careful engagement with his most vocal critics' actual arguments was something Peter kept entirely private, because acknowledging any merit in Jameson's position would have complicated the clean narrative of persecution that would have been more emotionally satisfying, and because the acknowledgement existed in the same internal space as everything else that was too complicated to share. The financial accounting that governed Peter's relationship with the Bugle had a specificity that he tracked, with the careful attention of someone for whom money was not abstract. Each photograph had a value that he assessed before the visit, based on the quality of the images and the newsworthiness of the situation they documented, and he had developed, through experience and through Betty's quietly offered guidance, a sense of what the market for these images would bear and when it was worth negotiating rather than accepting the first offer. He kept a running total in his private notebook of what the photographs were earning and what the money was being used for, a column of income and a column of expenditure that told the story of the Parker household's finances with the unsparing clarity of numbers, which do not editorialize and do not provide comfort, but which do provide the specific kind of information that allows a situation to be managed rather than simply endured. The column of expenditure contained May's medical costs, which were the largest and most variable item, and which Peter tracked with the focused attention of someone who understood that her health was the foundation on which everything else rested. It contained the household bills that Ben had previously managed, and that Peter had assumed without ceremony when the management of them became necessary. It contained the occasional replacement of Spider-Man equipment, web fluid chemicals and the mechanical components of the shooters that wore out through use, listed in the notebook under descriptions vague enough to be meaningless to any hypothetical reader, while specific enough to be useful to Peter himself. It contained at the bottom of the column a line he returned to sometimes with a quality of feeling he could not entirely categorize, representing the amount that remained after all the necessary things had been paid for, which was Jameson looked at Peter's photographs with the practiced eye of someone who understood their technical and commercial value, while simultaneously maintaining, without any apparent sense of contradiction, the editorial position that the subject of those photographs was a threat to the social order. He paid fair prices on these occasions, fairer than the editor offered on most of the other occasions, which Peter considered without reaching any conclusion he was comfortable with. because it suggested either that Jameson's commercial judgment was cleanly separable from his editorial convictions, or that there was some more complicated relationship between his hatred of Spider-Man and his willingness to pay well for images of him, and neither interpretation reflected entirely well on the situation. Jameson talked during these meetings, which was his general mode of occupying space, and Peter listened with the attentive patience he had developed for situations where listening carefully produced more useful information than speaking. Jameson's monologues on the subject of Spider-Man had the quality of arguments that had been refined through frequent repetition into something very close to their essential form, stripped of qualification and nuance by the repeated telling, until what remained was the pure, concentrated substance of conviction. Peter heard his own activities described in terms that were simultaneously recognizable and entirely wrong, accurate in their factual content and completely mistaken in their moral interpretation, and he sat with this experience of being known and misknown simultaneously in the chair across the desk from the man responsible for it, and said nothing that was not strictly necessary and kept his expression at the careful neutral of someone who has learned to keep their expression at the careful neutral. He walked out of the Bugle building on these occasions and stood on the pavement in whatever weather the city was offering that day, and allowed himself. In the 30 seconds he had allocated for private appreciation of absurdity, to recognize the specific comedy of his position. The man upstairs was at this moment revising his editorial calling for the capture and unmasking of the person who had just handed him photographs and accepted payment for them and said thank you on the way out. The photographs would run tomorrow under a headline that described Spider-Man as a threat. Peter would read the headline over breakfast and say nothing, and May would shake her head at the paper and say something warm and slightly indignant on Spider-Man's behalf, as she occasionally did, and Peter would agree with her assessment mildly and fold the paper and finish his coffee, and the morning would continue in its ordinary way. And the absurdity of it all was, when he allowed himself to feel it, genuinely funny, in the dark and private way that only he had access to, which was the only way that many of the best things in his life were funny, and which he had come, over the years, to regard not as a limitation but as a particular form of grace. There was a notebook that nobody ever read. This is, in the context of Peter Parker's life, a sentence that requires some qualification, because there were several notebooks that nobody ever read, a small archive of private documentation that he maintained across the years with the systematic consistency of someone who had learned early that the act of writing things down was not merely a record-keeping function, but a thinking function, a way of clarifying what he knew and identifying what he did not know and marking the boundary between the two with enough precision that he could direct his attention to the right side of it. But there was one notebook in particular, the one he had started in the days immediately following the morning of discovery in his bedroom, that occupied a different category from the others, not just a record but a conversation he was having with himself about the most extraordinary and most private subject available to him, which was the transformed fact of his own existence. The notebook was unremarkable on its outside, which was intentional. Peter had selected it from a bin of similar notebooks at the drugstore on the corner with the specific criterion of unmarkableness in mind, choosing the one whose cover was most likely to pass without interest through the visual field of anyone who might encounter it in his room, a plain composition book in the dark blue that suggested school notes rather than private investigation. It lived in the back of the second drawer of his desk, behind a folder of old biology assignments that provided sufficient visual context for the drawer's contents to read as entirely academic should anyone open it without specific intent to search. Nobody searched. May respected his privacy with the deliberate care that Peter understood and was grateful for, and the notebook remained unread across the years of its growth into something considerably more than its original, plain blue cover suggested it might contain. The first entries were observational in the strict scientific sense, recording measurements and phenomena with the economy of notation that good science requires, stripping the observations of emotional content and presenting them as data to be analysed rather than experiences to be interpreted. He had written down the weight of objects he had lifted, expressed in estimated pounds and cross-referenced with the known weights of comparable objects to produce a rough calibration of his enhanced strength. He had written down the distances at which his hearing resolved specific sounds into identifiable content, working outward from his bedroom in concentric circles that grew to encompass the full block, and eventually on clear evenings when the ambient noise of the city was at its minimum considerably beyond that. He had written down the spider sense in the imprecise language that imprecise phenomena require, noting the quality of the awareness it produced, the difference between the low-level background hum of general environmental monitoring and the sharp specific signal it generated in the presence of directed threat, trying to develop a vocabulary adequate to something that had no existing vocabulary because nothing like it had existed before in any literature he had access to. What the early entries reflected beyond their scientific content was the particular quality of Peter's mind in its engagement with extraordinary material, which was to say a mind that did not distinguish fundamentally between the extraordinary and the ordinary as categories of investigation, but applied the same methodical curiosity to both, treating his own transformed physiology with the same systematic interest he brought to chemistry problems and the same patient willingness to revise his understanding when new data contradicted his existing models. He was not, in these early pages, performing equanimity about what had happened to him. He was genuinely curious about it, interested in the mechanism and the implications and the specific parameters of the change in a way that the scientific framing made more manageable than the emotional framing would have. Because the emotional framing involved questions about identity and destiny, and the meaning of extraordinary gifts that were considerably harder to hold than questions about tensile strength and sensory range. The notebook grew denser and more complex as the months passed, and the data accumulated and the questions he was tracking became less purely observational and more theoretical. He had begun, by the time he was in the later months of his junior year of high school, to develop something that he thought of privately as a unified theory of his own capabilities, an attempt to understand not just what he could do individually, but how the various aspects of his transformed physiology related to and reinforced each other. Whether the spider sense and the enhanced strength and the wall crawling were manifestations of a single underlying biological change, or whether they represented distinct modifications that happened to have occurred simultaneously. This kind of theoretical inquiry produced no immediately practical result, served no operational purpose in his activities as Spider-Man, but it mattered to him in the way that understanding always mattered to him, independent of its utility, as an end in itself rather than a means to something else. He had developed, alongside the theoretical inquiry, a parallel set of entries that were less scientific in their character and more philosophical, though he would not have used the word philosophical to describe them because he associated that word with a formality and self-importance that did not fit the texture of what he was actually doing, which was thinking on paper about the ethical dimensions of what he had become and what he had chosen to do with it. These entries were written in a different register from the scientific ones, less economical and more exploratory, full of the circling and doubling back that genuine moral reasoning requires when it is being done honestly rather than toward a predetermined conclusion. He thought about the limits of his obligation, about the relationship between capability and responsibility that Ben had articulated and that he had turned into the organizing principle of his life, about the specific questions that this principle did not resolve on its own, but left open for the kind of case-by-case reasoning that produced no elegant general rules, but that was, he had come to believe, the only honest approach to decisions about which no general rule was entirely adequate. Empire State University arrived in Peter's life as both an expansion and a complication, which is perhaps the truest thing that can be said about higher education in the life of anyone who takes it seriously. The science facilities were extraordinary by the standard of anything he had previously had access to, and the first time he walked through the chemistry laboratories and the physics research wing, he felt the particular variety of pleasure that is specific to someone with genuine intellectual appetite, encountering resources adequate to that appetite for the first time, a pleasure that was almost physical in its specificity, located in the chest and the hands, the desire to touch everything and examine everything and understand how it worked. The university's equipment represented capabilities that his bedroom laboratory could not approach, and the presence of faculty whose expertise went so far beyond what he had been able to learn from books that conversations with them produced a specific form of cognitive vertigo, the awareness of how much more there was to know than he had previously been able to calculate. He took his courses with the focused engagement of someone for whom the courses were genuinely the point, rather than a social obligation or a credentialing exercise, and his professors noticed this in the way that professors notice genuine intellectual engagement, which is to say, they paid attention to him in the specific way of people who find their work made more interesting by the presence of someone who is also interested in it. He had a particular facility for the intersection of biology and chemistry, for the questions that lived in the space between disciplines. The mechanisms by which biological systems accomplished their structural and functional goals, and his professors in these areas encouraged his interest in ways that were gratifying, and also, practically speaking, limiting in the degree to which he could pursue them, because the time available for pure intellectual inquiry kept being reduced by the demands of everything else. The private notebook had a companion by this point, a second notebook devoted specifically to the technical problems that his activities as Spider-Man generated and that his enhanced scientific education was increasingly capable of addressing. The web fluid formula was the primary subject of this notebook in its early stages, and the entries documenting his ongoing refinement of the formula had the quality of a long-term research project conducted under unusual constraints. The unusual constraint being that he could not discuss the work with anyone, could not consult the faculty whose expertise in polymer chemistry was directly relevant to what he was trying to achieve, could not access the university's laboratory equipment for the testing that would have accelerated his progress enormously, but was required to do the work alone, in his bedroom, with the materials he could acquire without attracting questions he was not prepared to answer. He had made improvements to the original formula across the years since he first developed it, incremental advances that addressed specific weaknesses the operational testing of the material had revealed. The original version dissolved cleanly, but was sensitive to temperature in ways that created problems in winter and in rain, losing tensile strength in cold conditions and becoming tacky and unpredictable in wet ones. The revised version he developed during his first year at Empire State was more environmentally stable, maintaining its structural properties across a wider range of conditions through a modification to the base polymer chain that he had arrived at through a combination of theoretical reasoning and empirical testing. He had written this development up in the technical notebook with the thoroughness of someone documenting work that might need to be reconstructed, because the possibility that the notes might be lost or the formula forgotten was one he took seriously, the web shooters being sufficiently integral to his activities that losing access to functional web fluid was not an operational inconvenience, but a genuine crisis. The scientific life he was building at Empire State and the scientific life he was conducting in private were related but not identical, running parallel to each other in ways that were sometimes mutually reinforcing and sometimes productive of a specific and private frustration. His coursework in biochemistry opened theoretical frameworks that illuminated aspects of his own transformation that had previously been opaque to him, and he recorded these illuminations in the private notebook with the contained excitement of someone making connections they could not share with the people who had helped them make the connections. A lecture on the mechanisms of cellular adhesion produced 3 pages of private notes in which he worked through the implications for his wall-crawling ability, developing a model of how the transformation might have altered the structure of his fingertips and palms at the microscopic level to produce the adhesive quality he'd been experiencing as a brute fact of his existence, without previously having a mechanism to attribute it to. The satisfaction of this kind of understanding was real and complete in itself, requiring no external validation, which was fortunate because external validation was not available. The frustration was the other side of the same coin, the awareness of how much better his private scientific work could have been if it had been conducted in the open, with access to the full resources of the institution and the collaborative intelligence of the faculty and fellow students whose expertise was directly relevant to what he was investigating. He was doing original research on one of the most scientifically interesting subjects in the world, a human being whose genetic structure had been altered by radioactive exposure in ways that produced stable, functional enhancements rather than the cellular damage that radiation typically caused, and he was doing it alone in a bedroom in Queens with equipment that was good for a bedroom and entirely inadequate for the work it was being asked to do. The papers he might have published, the collaborations that might have developed, the scientific understanding that his situation could have contributed to if it had been available as data rather than sealed inside a secret, were a particular category of loss that he held quietly and without bitterness, because bitterness about things that could not be changed was not a productive use of the emotional resources he needed for other purposes. He had developed a practice of writing in the notebook late at night, in the hours after he returned from patrol and before the exhaustion of enhanced physical exertion fully claimed him, when his mind was still active enough to process what the evening had contained but tired enough to have relaxed its usual editorial vigilance and allowed things onto the page that more deliberate composition might have withheld. These late entries had a different character from the daytime scientific entries, less structured and more immediate, closer to the texture of actual thinking than to the presentation of conclusions. He wrote about the specific things he had encountered on a given night, the situations he had managed and the ones he had managed imperfectly, and the ones he had not managed at all, and he wrote about what these situations meant in terms of the questions he was perpetually working through about obligation and capacity, and the specific moral arithmetic of deciding where to be when he could not be everywhere at once. He wrote, in these late entries, about the people he did not save. This was the hardest portion of the private record, the part that cost him the most to write, and that he returned to with the least frequency but the most attention, because it contained the truest account of what the work actually felt like from the inside, which was not the account that would have been legible in any photograph he sold to the Bugle or in any news report that covered Spider-Man's activities. The public record of his work was a record of successes, of criminals apprehended and people rescued and situations resolved, and this record was accurate as far as it went, but it did not go to the places in the private notebook where he sat, with the specific weight of the times when the resolution had not come in time, when the spider sense had arrived at the same moment as the outcome rather than before it, when the web line had been a second too slow or aimed a degree too far from where it needed to be. He sat with these failures in the private record with the honest attention of someone who believed that the failures were as important as the successes to the project of understanding what he was doing and why, and whether he was doing it as well as it could be done. The notebooks were, in the end, the most complete portrait of Peter Parker that existed anywhere, fuller than any account that any other person had access to, more honest than any conversation he had been able to have, more comprehensive than the fragments of truth he distributed among the people in his life, according to what each relationship could receive. They contained the scientist and the hero, and the grieving boy, and the careful moral reasoner, and the exhausted young man lying on his bed at 2 a.m. trying to work out whether the decision he had made 3 hours earlier was the right one, or whether there was a better decision available that he had failed to see. They contained the accumulation of years of private thinking about the hardest questions that his extraordinary life kept generating, and they constituted a kind of ongoing argument with himself about how to live, conducted in the only forum where the argument could be entirely honest, which was the forum of his own undivided attention directed at the page in the quiet of a house that slept around him while he stayed awake a little longer, thinking. He kept them in a fireproof box eventually, which he stored at the back of his closet behind winter clothing and some boxes of things that had belonged to Ben and that May had asked him to keep when she could not bear to throw them away, but also could not bear to look at them daily. The fireproof box was a practical decision rooted in the straightforward recognition that the notebooks contained information whose loss would be a scientific and personal catastrophe. But it was also something else, something that had more to do with the value he placed on the record itself, on the fact of its existence as a true account of a life being examined honestly. He wanted the notebooks to survive not because anyone would ever read them, but because the act of writing them had been the primary way he stayed honest with himself across the years of maintaining a self that was too divided to be honest with anyone else. And the survival of the record felt like a way of honouring that honesty, of saying that it had been real, that it had mattered, that the private version of the story was worth preserving even in a fireproof box at the back of a closet that only he ever opened, in a house on Ingram Street where the most important things had always happened out of sight. The notebooks told the truth about everything, or as close to everything as language and private honesty could reach, but there was one subject on which even the private record was incomplete, not from any failure of honesty exactly, but from the particular difficulty of writing clearly about something that was happening to you while it was happening, that was still in motion, still unresolved, still carrying inside it the possibility of outcomes that you could not yet bear to examine directly. The subject was Gwen Stacy, and the incompleteness in the notebook entries about her was itself a form of information, a record of the places where Peter's usual capacity for clear-eyed self-examination encountered its limits and fell short, leaving behind entries that circled and approached and then retreated from the centre of what he was actually feeling, like a person walking around the edge of a room they cannot bring themselves to enter. He had met her in the way that people meet each other at universities, which is to say through the accumulated proximity of shared spaces and overlapping schedules, rather than through any single decisive encounter, the way that presence becomes familiarity becomes something with more weight than familiarity through a process so gradual that it is difficult to identify the moment when the transition occurred. She was in 2 of his science courses in his first semester at Empire State, and he had noticed her in the way he noticed things, with attention but without immediate interpretation, cataloguing her presence as a feature of the environment that his senses registered without yet knowing what to do with the registration. She was precise in her thinking and direct in expressing it, qualities that Peter recognized and valued because they were qualities he possessed, and that the world did not always reward in the people who possessed them. She asked questions in lecture that were genuinely questions rather than performances of intellectual engagement, questions that came from actual uncertainty rather than from the desire to be seen asking, and the quality of genuine curiosity was one he could identify with absolute reliability because he knew it so well from the inside. The coffee shop near campus where they first had a real conversation was the kind of place that universities generate around themselves like a natural ecosystem, unremarkable in its design but deeply familiar through frequency of use, the kind of space that becomes significant not through any inherent quality, but through what happens to have happened inside it over the years. They had ended up at the same small table in the back corner not through arrangement, but through the ordinary accident of 2 people arriving at approximately the same time at the only available seating, and the conversation that followed had the particular quality of conversations that are ostensibly about one thing, and are actually about something else, ostensibly about the biochemistry lecture they had both just come from, and actually about the way each of them thought, the specific textures of their intellectual engagement with the world, a mutual recognition of a kind of mind that finds its own reflection in another mind and responds to the recognition with something close to relief. Peter walked back to his classes after that conversation in the particular state of someone who is thinking about something while trying not to think about it, which is the state that precedes the admission that the something matters. He thought the problem was the secret, as the problem so often was, but the problem of the secret with Gwen was different from the way the problem of the secret manifested with other people in his life, different from the way it was with Betty, different from the way it was with Harry, different even from the way it was with Aunt May. With May the secret was something she had chosen in her own way to accommodate, and the accommodation was its own form of honesty. With Harry the secret was a wall that Peter had built and that Harry lived beside without quite knowing it was there. With Betty, the secret had created a distance that made the relationship ultimately impossible, in a way that Peter understood and accepted without being able to prevent. But with Gwen, the secret was a specific and ongoing act of withholding, directed at the person he most wanted to give everything to, and this made it feel different in kind rather than just in degree, not merely the maintenance of a private life, but something closer to a daily choice to deceive someone who deserved better. He thought about telling her more than he had thought about telling anyone else, more consistently and more seriously, returning to the question across weeks and months with the methodical attention he brought to problems that mattered, examining the arguments on each side with the honest intention of reaching a conclusion he could actually hold. The arguments for telling her were strong, rooted in his genuine love for her, and in the recognition that a relationship founded on incomplete truth was a relationship with a structural weakness that would eventually fail unless the foundation was corrected. She was intelligent and honest and capable of handling difficult information, of that he had no doubt. She was someone whose judgment he trusted more than he trusted that of most people in his life. She would understand, or she would try to understand, which was all he could reasonably ask of anyone. The arguments against telling her were also strong, but they were strong in the particular way of arguments that are not entirely honest with themselves, that carry beneath their stated reasoning an unstated reasoning that is doing most of the actual work. The stated reasoning was about her safety, about the genuine and documented risk that knowing Spider-Man's identity created for the person who possessed that knowledge, about the enemies who would not hesitate to use her as a tool against him if they understood her importance to him. This reasoning was real, was not invented as cover for the other reasoning, was grounded in a genuine understanding of the dangers that his activities generated, and the ways those dangers could propagate outward to the people near him. But it was not the whole of the argument, and the private notebook captured this incompleteness more honestly than he managed to capture it in his conscious thinking about the question, the entries in which he worked through his reasoning revealing, in their circling and their retreating, that there was also fear underneath the safety argument, fear of her response, fear of what the truth would require of the relationship. Fear. They walked. Captain and Peter sat across from him at the family's dinner table on Sunday evenings and felt himself being assessed with a thoroughness that was not hostile, but was entirely honest in its method. The assessment of someone whose professional life had depended on accurate evaluation of the people in front of him. He understood, gradually and without any single confirming moment, that Captain Stacy knew. Not knew with certainty, perhaps, not knew in the way of someone who had definitive proof, but knew in the way that a detective knows things before the proof arrives, through the accumulation of small observations that pointed in the same direction. He knew because he watched the way Peter tracked movement in a room, the quality of attention he paid to exits and entrances and the positions of people relative to each other, the same spatial awareness that a man who had spent his career attending to those details would have recognized as something more than ordinary social perceptiveness. He knew because of the injuries, the ones that appeared and disappeared on a schedule inconsistent with ordinary physical life, that a man accustomed to seeing injuries on people who did physically demanding and dangerous work would have found familiar. He knew because of the photographs, perhaps, because a detective with good pattern recognition and a photographer nephew would have had opportunities to notice patterns in the images that someone less systematic would have missed. Neither conversations in which Stacy said things that were too specifically relevant to be coincidental, but that maintained always the formal deniability of the general rather than the particular. The quality of grief that Gwen carried after her mother's death, which had occurred before Peter knew her, and which had shaped her in ways he came to understand gradually through the texture of her responses to things rather than through any direct account, was something that made her more familiar to him rather than less, recognizable in its effects as belonging to the same category as his own experience of growing up around the fact of loss. She had learned, as he had learned, to carry absence as a companion rather than an opponent, to find in the continued presence of a surviving parent the particular intensity of love that comes from understanding its finitude, and this understanding was one of the things that made their relationship feel more than usually honest in its emotional foundations, built on something real rather than on the performance of feelings untested by difficulty. The calculation he performed about the secret, when he performed it honestly, produced no clean answer, only the recognition that both options involved costs he was not willing to pay, that telling her would expose her to dangers that were not theoretical, and that not telling her maintained a distance between them that was also a cost, less dramatic but equally real, accumulating daily in the form of the things he could not say, and the questions he deflected, and the moments when she looked at him with a quality of gentle puzzlement that suggested she knew there was more than he was sharing, and had decided out of the love she had for him not to press the question. She gave undemonstrative closeness of people who did not need to perform their love because it was simply the water they both swam in. He loved the way she talked to Captain Stacy, with a directness and an equality that suggested she had been raised to believe her opinions were worth hearing, which they were, which Stacy clearly believed, which Peter found both admirable and quietly affecting, in the specific way that evidence of good parenting always affected him. He wrote about all of this in the private notebook, or tried to, in the late-night entries that were more honest than the daytime ones, and the entries about Gwen were the ones that most clearly showed the limits of his honest self-examination, the places where the circling and the approaching and the retreating from the centre of things was most visible. He wrote around what he felt more than he wrote about it, noted the facts of the relationship and the chronology of their time together, and the specific moments that seemed to matter without always being able to say fully what they meant to him, or what he was afraid of, or what he wanted in the way of a future that the secret made impossible to plan with any honesty. He knew that the secret was a wrong he was doing her, and he held this knowledge with the same steady attention he gave to the other moral weights in his life, and he did not resolve it because the resolution available, the telling, cost too much in the currency of her safety, and the other resolution, the ending of the relationship, cost too much in the currency of everything else, and so he held the wrong and loved her and hoped, in the private way of someone who understood, that hope was not a strategy, but kept returning to it anyway. That the account would eventually be settled in a way that did not require her to pay the largest portion of the cost. The Sunday evenings at the Stacy house continued through the autumn and into the winter of his first year at Empire State, and they became one of the things he returned to with the most reliable pleasure in the ongoing private accounting of what his life contained that was worth being grateful for. The dinners were good, and the conversation was good, and Captain Stacy watched him across the table with the quiet assessment of a man who had decided that what he was watching was, on the whole, something worth watching with the quality of attention that respect rather than suspicion produces, and Gwen sat beside him and talked about the things she cared about with the directness he loved, and the Sunday evenings held all of them in the particular warmth of a household, organised, however quietly and however incompletely, around the ongoing project of human connection, which was the project that mattered most and that his extraordinary and divided life made most difficult, and that he returned to, despite the difficulty, again and again, because the alternative was a kind of poverty of the self that all the web fluid formulas in his private notebook could not address. The friendship with Harry Osborn was the one that had come most easily, which made it in some ways the most complicated to hold honestly, because things that come easily tend to be taken for granted in ways that things requiring effort are not, and the taking for granted of Harry's friendship was something Peter recognised in himself with a clarity that did not make him proud, and that he returned to with the particular guilt of someone who knew they had not always given a relationship the attention it deserved, while the relationship was still available to receive it. Harry had, in the way of people who look back at the beginning of important relationships and find in them a clarity of perception that may have been present or may be a story, the memory constructs after the fact to give the beginning the weight the relationship eventually earned. What he said he recognised was the quality of someone who was not interested in what Harry could provide, the social access and the financial generosity, and the reflected prestige of associating with the Osborn name, but only in Harry himself, and this recognition, whether it was immediate or retrospective, was accurate as a description of Peter's actual disposition, who found the Osborn wealth more of an awkwardness than an attraction, and who had spent the early months of their friendship navigating Harry's instinct toward generosity with the careful balance of someone who wanted neither to offend the impulse nor to become dependent on it. The texture of their friendship in its early years was the texture of two people discovering, with some surprise on both sides, that the other was more interesting than the surface suggested. Harry was funnier than his initial presentation indicated, possessed of a dry, self-deprecating humour that emerged once he was comfortable enough to stop performing the version of himself that social situations generally demanded, and Peter responded to this humour with the genuine laughter of someone who had not expected to find it there, and was genuinely pleased by the finding. Harry was also more perceptive about people than the social ease that surrounded him might have suggested. Peter had developed, through years of paying close attention to the people around him, a reliable sensitivity to these kinds of behavioural signals, and what he read in Harry's signals about Norman was a relationship of profound ambivalence, of love that was real and need that was real, and a chronic insufficiency of reciprocation that had shaped Harry's understanding of his own worth in ways that Harry himself was not fully aware of, and that Peter could see with the clarity of someone who had experienced a very different kind of parental love, and could therefore recognise its absence in someone else. He met Norman on a handful of occasions in the first year, at the Osborn apartment and at a university function that Norman attended in his capacity as a trustee, and the encounters confirmed what Harry's behavioural signals had suggested, while also adding dimensions that the signals alone had not conveyed. Norman Osborn was formidable in the way that people who have built things from will and intelligence tend to be formidable, carrying with him the concentrated authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions that mattered, and being right about them, often enough to trust his own judgment, with the completeness that sometimes tips into arrogance, and sometimes into something darker. He looked at Peter with the assessing attention of someone evaluating a variable in an equation he was solving about his son's life, and Peter returned the assessment with the careful neutrality of someone who had become practiced at not revealing the full extent of his perceptions. And the two of them established in these early encounters a mutual watchfulness that neither named, and that would eventually prove to have been entirely justified. The knowledge, when it came, arrived in the specific way that the most significant revelations tend to arrive, not through a single dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of evidence that gradually became impossible to interpret in any configuration other than the true one. Peter had known that the Green Goblin was someone with resources and intelligence, and a specific quality of strategic malice that went beyond ordinary criminal ambition, had known this for months before the evidence resolved itself into the specific face behind the mask. The resolution, when it came, produced in him a stillness that was the opposite of the shock it might have been expected to produce, a stillness that was the product of a part of him that had been tracking the evidence and arriving at its own conclusion at a pace slower than the conscious recognition required, so that when the conscious recognition arrived, the ground had already been prepared for it, and the shock was absorbed into the stillness before it could become something that showed on his face. The specific difficulty of knowing what he knew about Norman while continuing to sit across from Harry at dinners and in the apartment and in the various contexts of their friendship was a difficulty that Peter carried entirely alone, because there was no one he could bring it to, no one with whom he could think through the implications and the obligations and the specific moral arithmetic of a situation in which his closest friend was the son of the person who was simultaneously a dangerous criminal and a man whose criminal identity was known only to Peter because of his own secret identity, which he also could not share with Harry, creating an enclosure of secrets that prevented any honest engagement with any part of the situation from any direction. He sat with Harry, and he listened to Harry talk about his father with the complicated love of a son who has never received the approval he needed and has never stopped needing it, and Peter listened with the full attention of genuine friendship and with the private weight of knowing things about Norman that made Harry's love for him both more painful to witness and more impossible to address. Harry's addiction developed in the way that addictions develop when they are rooted in emotional pain that has no other available outlet, gradually and then suddenly, invisibly, and then with a visibility that was itself a form of communication, a way of making external the internal distress that had been accumulating across years of insufficient acknowledgement. Peter watched this development with the helplessness of someone who can see a process clearly and cannot intervene in it effectively, because the intervention requires honesty that is not available, requires the kind of direct conversation about Norman and about the Osborn household that Peter could not have, without either revealing his secret or lying about the basis of his knowledge, both of which were impossible in their different ways. He helped in the ways he could, with presence and with the specific practical attentions of someone who cared about another person's physical safety, but he was not able to help in the way that might have mattered most, which was to say, honestly and completely, and the knowledge of this limitation was one of the consistent low-level griefs of the friendship. The evenings he spent in Harry's company during the period of Harry's worst difficulties had a quality that Peter returned to later with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, gratitude for the moments of genuine connection that persisted through the difficulty, sorrow for the distance that the secrets maintained even in those moments. Harry would be in a state of partial recovery, attempting the particular brave performance of someone trying to appear more functional than they actually were for the benefit of someone they did not want to worry. And Peter would receive the performance with the care of someone who understood its emotional cost and did not want to make it more expensive by demonstrating that he could see through it. They talked in these evenings about things that were adjacent to the things they needed to talk about, moving around the centre of Harry's pain with the mutual tact of two people who cared about each other and were limited in different ways in what they could say directly. Norman's death arrived in Peter's private experience as a compound event, the simultaneous resolution of the immediate physical threat and the permanent complication of everything connected to Harry. In the aftermath of what happened on the bridge, in the hours and days that followed when the city was processing its version of events, and the people in Peter's personal life were processing their own, Harry was the presence whose grief was most immediately visible and most immediately impossible to address with anything approaching honesty. He watched Harry receive the news of his father's death through the filtered, incomplete version of events that was all that was available to Harry, and he sat with him in the Osborn apartment in the days that followed and said the things that genuine friendship required of him, and held the private knowledge of everything he could not say with the steadiness of someone who had become practiced at holding things that could not be put down. Harry's grief was layered in ways that grief is layered when the relationship it mourns was itself layered, when love and damage and unresolved need all existed together in the space that the loss had now made empty. He grieved the father he had lost, and he also grieved the approval he had never received and would now never receive, and he grieved some version of the relationship that might have existed if circumstances had been different, and he was angry in the specific way of someone who will never now have the conversation that needed to happen, who has been permanently denied the possibility of resolution by a finality they did not choose. Peter sat beside this grief and loved his friend through it, with the genuine love of someone who understood loss deeply, and understood also the particular complication of mourning a relationship that was never quite what it should have been. The discovery of Norman's equipment. The slow understanding that worked its way into Harry across months of grief and instability, and the chemical chaos of his continued addiction, produced in Peter a specific and private dread that he could not share with Harry, because any discussion of the equipment and what it represented required the acknowledgement of knowledge Peter was not supposed to have. He watched Harry move toward the Green Goblin identity with the terrible helplessness of someone watching a preventable thing occur that they cannot prevent because the prevention requires the revelation of everything, and the revelation of everything remained the one action that his accumulated reasoning continued to identify as impossible, not from cowardice exactly, but from the honest assessment that the revelation would not save Harry and would cost Peter everything else. The battles with Harry were the most privately devastating confrontations of his career, more devastating than the battles with Norman had been, because Norman had been a stranger before he was an enemy, while Harry had been a friend before he was an enemy, and remained a friend underneath the enmity in ways that Norman had never been, that the enmity never fully suppressed or replaced. He fought Harry with the restraint of someone for whom the goal was never victory in the conventional sense, but always something more specific and more difficult. The recovery of the person underneath the Goblin identity, the return of the man he had known to himself. This restraint cost him physically and emotionally across the course of their conflict, in ways that a less complicated opposition would not have cost him, because you fight differently when the person across from you is someone you love, when every exchange has to be calibrated against the possibility that the next moment might be the moment the person returns to themselves and the fight can stop. Harry's final day was a Thursday, which is the kind of specific and arbitrary detail that grief tends to preserve while discarding more apparently significant information, and Peter sat with him in the aftermath of the warehouse, and held the weight of a dying man who was also his oldest friend, and received the last words that Harry was able to offer with the complete attention that those words deserved and that he would carry inside him for the rest of his life. Harry said that he knew, at the end, that Peter had always been trying to save him, not defeat him, and that this had mattered even when he was not capable of receiving it, that the knowledge of it had existed underneath the Goblin identity the whole time like a pilot light, that the chemistry and the madness had not been able to fully extinguish. He said that Peter had been the best friend he had, and Peter held this statement with the full weight of all the years it summarized and said that Harry had been the same to him. Which was true, and which cost him something to say in the specific way that true things said too, late always cost something, carrying in them the accumulated price of all the times they could have been said earlier and were not. He stood at Harry's graveside in the autumn rain, and looked at the faces of the people who had come to mourn a man whose full story none of them knew, and he carried inside him the complete story, with the particular loneliness of the only witness, the person who understood all of it, the whole arc from the beginning to the end, and who had no one to share that understanding with, because the understanding was constructed from materials that could not be disclosed. The grief was real, and the love that the grief represented was real, and the loneliness of holding both of them without being able to set either of them down was also real, and he stood in the rain and let it be what it was, the complicated, incomplete, deeply human conclusion to a friendship that had mattered enormously, and that the secret had prevented from ever being entirely what it might have been, and he thought that Harry deserved better, and he thought that this was true, and also that it had always been true, and that the knowledge of it was the thing he would carry longest. Longer than the grief, perhaps. Longer than the specific memories, the quiet, persistent awareness of the gap between what the friendship was and what, without the secret between them, it might have been allowed to become. And so we come gently to rest here, at the quiet edge of this story, in the space where the web lines go still, and the city below settles into its deepest dark, and the man in the mask becomes simply a person, breathing, present, held by the same ordinary night that holds all of us. What we have moved through together tonight is not finally a story about power, though power was present throughout it. It is a story about the private life of care, about what it costs to love people you cannot fully be known by, to protect a world that cannot know who is protecting it, to carry the weight of responsibility not as a burden imposed from outside, but as a choice made again and again from the inside, in the quiet, in the dark, without applause or witness. These are not extraordinary things in the end. These are the things that quiet and devoted people do every day, in every life, in every house where someone gets up before the others, and makes the coffee and tends the garden, and holds the secrets that love sometimes requires. Let the web go slack now. Let the city rest. You have been known tonight, in the way that good stories know us, and you may sleep.